5.
Initiating these dialogues for space sustainability, it is more important now than ever.
4.
Countries setting a good example through adopting best principles and best practices.
3.
With soft power comes really strong leadership.
2.
In the space community, we're aware of how fragile the space environment is.
1.
Hello, I'm Crystal Azelton, Director of the Space Application Programs at the Secure World Foundation. As the conference chair for this year's Summit for Space Sustainability, I am so pleased to have more than 650 registered participants. Welcome. I know there are many competing demands for your time and attention, and I'm incredibly pleased that you've decided to join us today. We've got a lot of great content packed into the next few days. The Secure World Foundation launched this conference 2 years ago with the intention of being the premier forum for discussing issues around space sustainability, the only one focused on all aspects and areas of the topic and with an eye towards solutions, problem solving, and the future. Given ongoing events around the world, we considered canceling this year's event and waiting until we can all meet in person. But much like I stated at the beginning of the last Summit for Space Sustainability, space activity has not stopped. Rockets are still launching. Governments are still supporting science missions and human explorations and writing regulations. Industry is still working to improve services to its customers. So here we are to talk about emerging trends, to explore unique international and national perspectives, and to examine aspects of issues that honestly don't get enough attention. Before we go any further, I would be remiss not to extend a warm thank you to our sponsors. Our digital content sponsors are here today, virtually of course, to demonstrate their commitment to improving space sustainability. They are a diverse group of organizations that showcase just how important this topic is to the entire space community, and we are deeply grateful for their support. So thank you to our returning sponsors, Astroscale, ESA, ULA, Space Logistics, the Space and Sustainability Initiative at CYU Boulder, and also welcome and thanks to our new sponsors, BHO Legal, Leo Labs, Clifford Chance, KPMG, and Comstock. We are also excited to highlight some great digital content from them. So please check out our website, swfsummit.org, for more information. We also have a really generous set of media sponsors, GVF, Sat News, Spacewatch Global, and Space News. I encourage all of you to engage with and subscribe to the great sources of information available from all of our media sponsors. Next, I want to highlight our young professional content from this year. The pandemic has really made networking and engagement by young professionals extremely difficult. That's why this year we've added a lot of content providing opportunities for young professionals to engage on space sustainability topics. It's my privilege to announce the winners of our student essay competition. It was with great difficulty that we selected 4 winners from among the many insightful and well-researched responses. Congrats to Renata, Nathaniel, Andrew, and Sravanti. Check out their submissions on our website. Thank you to all of you who contributed via your registration fee. That's part of what made this essay competition possible. In addition, I'd like you to check out our Next Gen video series, highlighting a range of talented young professionals who all work with our sponsor organizations. You can learn about their backgrounds and current work in this engaging content. That is also available on the Summit website. Finally, we invite anyone who registered as a young professional to attend one of our mentoring sessions that are being offered on Thursday. You should have already received your invitation if you're signed up as a young professional, and if not, check your spam and let us know and we'll get that to you. We're holding 2 sessions, one at 9 a.m. Eastern and one at 7 Eastern to accommodate as many schedules as possible. We have a really exciting lineup of mentors for you to engage with, so be sure to sign up via that registration email. Next, I have an exciting announcement to make about our summit. Tomorrow, we will not only hear a candid interview from Tori Bruno, President and CEO of the United Launch Alliance, we will also be hearing an additional keynote from Bhavya Lal, who serves as the Senior Advisor to the NASA Administrator for Budget and Finance. She was the senior-most White House appointee and acting chief of staff at NASA for the first 100 days of the Biden administration, the agency's transition to the administration under Joe Biden. Before that, she served as part of the transition agency review team for both NASA and the Department of Defense. So as you can imagine, this is an exciting opportunity to hear about space sustainability from the new administration. That will be tomorrow at 12:15, extending our day just slightly. So if you're planning to sign off, we have extended the agenda to accommodate this keynote by Ms. Lal. And then finally, I have a little bit of housekeeping. We choose to host this as a live event in part to make sure there would be a chance for interaction between our participants and our speakers, limited as we are in this virtual environment. Every panel has time set aside for various audience interventions, including polls and Q&A. All you need to do is click the link located below the live stream feed, or you can go directly to menti.com and enter the code 33235686. You can see it right there on your screen. In fact, you can participate in our very first poll of the day right now. So be sure to check that out. Next, we're going to turn to our opening panel. In this panel, we are going to explore the topic of Earth observation data and technology and climate change. To lay the groundwork for this conversation, we have our first spotlight speaker of the day, Walid Abdelati. He will be giving us an overview of the topic and some food for thought for our panelists to consider.
Hi, my name is Walid Abdelati. I'm the director of CERES, the Cooperative Institute for Research in Environmental Sciences. And with regard to the question, can space do more to support action on climate change? The first part of my answer to that is space has already done plenty. But the second part is, yes, of course, it can do more to support action. As far as what it has done, the space-based perspective has provided foundational knowledge and information. In other words, the data to help us understand climate change and inform action. And it does this in part by allowing us to access otherwise inaccessible places. The Arctic, the middle of the Sahara Desert, the Amazon rainforest. Now, we can go to these places, but to observe large-scale behavior really requires satellite observations. The second is the space-based perspective allows us to see the world in ways our eyes can't by using the full part of the electromagnetic spectrum, ultraviolet, microwave radiation, thermal infrared, in addition to visible. We're able to, quote-unquote, see things that our eyes otherwise couldn't. And the third is perspective, the large-scale perspective of global processes in the Earth system and the interactions among the elements of the Earth system. So what have space-based observations told us with regard to climate change that have helped us understand the situation? Well, I'm just going to give you a few examples that illustrate the points I made before about how we observe from space and what that enables us to do. The first is the shrinking Arctic sea ice cover. We're all aware that over the last several decades, Arctic sea ice has been shrinking substantially. We know this because of satellite observations. If we physically went a few hundred miles above the Earth and looked down at the Arctic, we wouldn't see the sea ice. The clouds would be in the way. But because we measure it with at microwave wavelengths, the microwaves penetrate the clouds and we're able to see the ice below and its behavior. And so we can see in the late 70s, compared to just last year, substantial losses of Arctic sea ice cover. Another area that's close to home for me is wildfires. Again, the satellite observations allow us to see fires on a continental scale, their number, their duration, their intensity, and subsequently the fire damage that's done, the spatial extent of these fires. Looking from space helps us get a sense of the behavior of these fires and their evolution with time, both evolution within a fire incident, but evolution from year to year as to how much these are growing, how more widespread they're becoming. Another area from a global perspective standpoint is sea level rise. Using satellites, we've measured sea level rise reliably since the early 1990s, and what you see here is the spatial distribution of sea level rise. So we can estimate global rise, but also how it varies from location to location, which is dependent on where the energy is being absorbed in the ocean, where the water and ice that are causing the seas to rise, in addition to thermal expansion, are coming in from. And the satellite perspective, by orbiting the Earth repeatedly over and over and over for decades, tells us the regional characteristics, which makes a huge difference in the implications for coastal regions. A few inches, a difference of a few inches has tremendous implications for people worldwide. And then this last example is really a great illustration of interaction between components of the Earth system. This is the carbon dioxide uptake from vegetation, and what you see is CO2, carbon dioxide, overlaid on the annual vegetation patterns. And you can see as spring arrives in the northern hemisphere, we can watch the CO2 uptake by the vegetation in the northern hemisphere, and as fall comes, we watch the increase in CO2 as there is less vegetation to take up that carbon dioxide. So the space-based perspective has already told us much, but it's got a lot to tell us going forward. Now, ultimately, the solutions to the climate change challenge is going to depend on policy and sound decision making, the choices we make as a society. And those policies and those choices need data to be made in an informed way. And that, again, is what the space-based perspective tells us. So what can these observations do in the future? Well, one, we can continue watching the climate change story unfold, whether it be manifested through rising oceans, increased fire, changes in hurricane behavior, just plain warming, the implications for vegetation, whatever. The space-based perspective allows us to look at the global scale and understand how that story is unfolding. We can also, through new investments, make new kinds of observations that can help us get at the root of these changes, but also inform the implications of our choices so that we can make our choices better. Or provide information on the implications of our choices. These data improve models. When we observe and understand, we get better at predicting. So taking these data and understanding the processes at work and improving our models accordingly allows us to better predict the future, better understand what we're in for, and better prepare for what's coming, and better mitigate the changes that will happen. So ultimately, this information, through the direct observations or how we inform our models, will inform policy, will inform our choices. And the good news is we've got the technology, we've got the scientific expertise and capability. What we need is the investment, and we've been lucky that there have been robust investments for quite some time. But when compared to the implications of the climate change challenge and the costs associated with it, those investments have been comparatively small. So with increased investments, we'll be able to do more. We'll be able to better position ourselves to meet the challenges that are undoubtedly coming. And I'm going to leave you with a quote, a pretty powerful one in my view, by Socrates from 400 BC. Even then he knew, man must rise above the earth to the top of the atmosphere and beyond, for only thus will he fully understand the world in which he lives. It was true then, it was true today, and it'll be true tomorrow. So thank you for your attention, and thank you to the organizers for putting this session together, and to the other members of this session contributing on the panel. I appreciate being a part of it.
Well, that certainly got us off to a good start. I think it comes as no surprise to anyone that space technologies can contribute significantly to global efforts to mitigate and adapt to climate change, and that indeed these technologies have already been instrumental in helping scientists gain a better picture of the urgency of climate change. But what we're here to discuss today is the knowledge and the technology gaps. What's needed? What's next in terms of new technologies, in terms of how we process and manage current data to ensure that humanity has a full understanding of the problem and is able to take informed action. To try to answer those questions, I will turn to my panel. While that's up, just a quick reminder that we do have a poll on Mentimeter, so please follow the link just below your streaming feed to participate. I am incredibly honored to introduce this panel. It's not often that I get starstruck, but we have a really incredible lineup for you today. To start with, Marion Diop-Kane is a meteorologist with long experience in forecasting and research into the African monsoon and weather systems. Following a period as the Director of Meteorology at the National Agency for Civil Aviation and Meteorology of Senegal, she is currently a program manager at the WMO Africa Regional Office in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. Lori Garver is CEO of Earthrise Alliance, a philanthropic initiative established to fully utilize Earth science data to combat climate change. In her illustrious career, she was also the Deputy Administrator of NASA and the Executive Director at the National Space Society, among many other roles. Steve Homburg is Chief Scientist at the Environmental Defense Fund. He has served as the lead author for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change at the UN and was recognized as one of the scientists contributing to the award of the 2007 Nobel Peace Prize. Finally, we have Thelma Krug, who is the former Deputy National Secretary at the Secretary of Policies and Programs of Science Technology at the Ministry of Science, Technology, Innovation, and Communication in Brazil. And in 2015, she was elected Vice Chair of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Welcome to my panel. Wonderful. Hello, everyone. Great. So you are all live now.
Morning.
Morning. So you're all live now. I'm actually going to start with Ms. Krug. The IPCC is currently undertaking the 6th assessment report on science related to climate change. I'd like you to start by telling us what role does Earth observation play in this process? And in your opinion, what has changed since the last assessment report?
Okay, thank you very much, Crystal. And before I start, let me also congratulate the winners of the contest. We really need all stimulating young people, to get interested in this subject. Also, thanks for the opportunity to be here. And I think that Willie has really set up the scene for this discussion here. He said that we already have a lot of remotely sensed data, but this can do more. Satellite information can do more. And we see this increasingly with the IPCC assessment reports. So if I can give just a little bit of the background, the IPCC does not do the research itself. It relies on the assessment of a broad range of literature that is relevant for the for climate change, including the physical basis of climate change, impacts, adaptation and vulnerability, and mitigation of climate change. So we have these 3 big working groups in the IPCC that work in the assessment of the literature worldwide. And this is why it's so important that we have publications, scientific publications, information from the socioeconomics and technological also information. So if we look, increasingly, IPCC has been more than 30 years doing these assessments. We are in the 6th cycle now. So if we go back and see how it improves and how much it relies on remotely sensed data, not only to improve the model capacity to project future climate change, but also on many of the relevant points that Willie has put forward, including the shrinking of the sea ice cover, the fires in terms of their intensity, their frequency. We know that climate change projects with climate change increasing. We project more fires, greater intensity, and so on. And remotely sensed data is a incredible tool that we can use to look at this and look at shifts in the trend of the observations. Okay, but to respond to your question objectively, I think that I sought to consult Working Group 1 that works on the physical basis of climate change. And why is that? It's because their assessment report is coming up for approval of the 195 governments now in July and August. So we are going to have new information coming up. And from the point of view of remotely sensed data, Working Group 1 selected 5 points where they see improvements. So I'm going to just highlight those points very quickly. One is the improved understanding of the drivers and their role in the Earth's energy imbalance. So we know that, for instance, some publications that just both satellite and in situ observations independently show an approximate doubling of this unbalance from mid-2005 to mid-2019. So it's just this imbalance in the incoming flux to the outgoing one. The second one is the closure of the Earth's energy budget through atmosphere, ice, ocean, land monitoring. So remotely sensed information is really important when we look at this energy budget, because we want to include information from the atmosphere, aerosols, greenhouse gases, surface albedo, clouds, vegetation, land use patterns. So remotely sensed data has a huge contribution for us to assess these. The third one is on the closure of the sea level budget, and which aims to reduce the current uncertainties on sea level change and the individual components for this change. So when we reduce uncertainties of sea level change, it improves our understanding of the processes involved in causing this global mean sea level rise and the regional variability. So this is the third one. When we talk about closure of both the energy budget and sea level budget, we mean to reduce uncertainties. And throughout the assessments of the IPCC, you see this very clearly. So one of the real challenges we have is to really improve our ability to project the future and see the changes, and remotely sensed data is there. The fourth issue is also narrowing the range of equilibrium climate sensitivity, including through improved observation constraints on feedbacks. And we see, for instance, that in AR4 of 2007, we did have this range of equilibrium climate sensitivity using a model which was the CMIP3, changed in the assessment of 2014 using another model based on another characteristics. And now in AR6, we are going to even have an improved modeling approach, which will help us to narrow the range of equilibrium in climate sensitivity. And finally, the last one is the growing field of constraining climate projections. We are talking about this new area of emergent constraints that is coming up, combining these emerging constraints and relating them with observations that could reduce uncertainty surrounding future climate. On the last 2 points that were made by Working Group 1, and I think that this is very general. I think that the points I made were very technical in nature, but 2 important issues they highlighted. One is the importance of remotely sensed data for the quality of reanalysis and the challenges that are linked to the continuity and also homogeneity of the measurements for doing that. Mm-hmm. So we see that remotely sensed data need to ensure this continuity so that we can do reanalysis, looking, from past information and observations, but we need to have continuity of this. So we see that the need for the programs to have continuity and consistency. The second point.
So I want to come back to that point. So I think what we'll do, I'm going to go to the next question, but I'd like to come back to this idea of the continuity of data, because I think that's really going to be key for our audience to understand that challenge.
Okay, that's perfect. First, just a small point, Crystal, and it's also the regional information. It's really the importance of having this really going from the broad to the smaller scale. So those are the 2 points that Working Group 1 finally made. Thank you.
That's actually the perfect segue into our next speaker, Ms. Kane. I wanted to ask you about climate services for adaptation and how they're generated through the Global Framework for Climate Services, and specifically about that situation in Africa. What are the unique challenges that you face there? Marianne?
Thank you, Crystal. Thank you, Crystal. Do you hear me? My internet is going on and off. I hope
You're
you can
fine right
hear
now.
me.
Good.
Okay, well, it's a pleasure to be part of this panel. Climate change is definitely inevitable. We are already in it with climate variability and increase of extreme events, both in frequency and intensity. All parties are working to keep to the Paris Agreement and keep the temperature change down to 1.5 degrees Celsius increase. Meanwhile, we need to adapt and move to climate resilient, climate smart activities to get the best out of it and minimize the impact on societies and economies. So climate services can help, surely. They're essential tools for adaptation to climate change. And many reports, as you may know, have shown that investing in climate services has many benefits. It's been rated to 1 out of 4. So climate services are really essential for climate adaptation. So following the Third World Climate Conference, the GFCS was established with a 3-tier organization at global level, regional, and national level. And climate services are realized through a value chain from operational hydrometeorological systems, including the observation networks, data and databases, climate monitoring and forecasting products, and provision and delivery of services, and all through partnership, research and innovation and development, as well as user interface platform. WMO, Global Producing Centers, will feed information into the regional climate centers, which in turn process regional products to be used and adapted by national meteorological and hydrological services to meet their users' needs. National meteorological and hydrological services develop tailored product through a user interface platform, as I just said, and through collaborative research, both at national level and international level, and partnership to support planning and decision-making in climate-sensitive sectors, such as agriculture and food security, water resources management, health, energy, disaster risk reduction to achieve improved climate-related outcomes and generate socio-economic benefit. One example of climate services is the seasonal forecasts produced during the Regional Climate Outlook Forums, the RCOFs, and these have been established over 20 years now and have a nearly global coverage. And at the end, organize their National Climate Outlook Forum, where they define, refine the forecast at national level, and update it throughout the rainy season. And the tendency of the rainy season is then well known, well in advance, as well as perspective for food security or insecurity. And this is very important for Africa, which is highly dependent. Challenges in Africa are many, but the main one I would say is for data and infrastructure, as well as expertise. But for expertise, well, we have a growing number of experts, but the issue is to have a critical mass of experts being retained at national level and develop those climate services. For the data and infrastructure, we've been having a steady decrease of the observation data. And this is not with significant
I think
and climate constellations.
Thank you, Marianne. I think we're losing you a little bit, so hopefully that Marianne? I think we're losing you a little bit, so I'm going to move on to our next question and swing back to you because you were just getting into the challenges, and I'd like to hear more about that. My next question is for Lori. Your organization works to convert Earth data systems into relevant and actionable knowledge to combat climate change. Can you talk to us about how the different audiences, ranging from the general public to policymakers to scientists, what are the different needs when it comes to understanding the climate change data that is generated by Earth observation satellites?
Sure. Thanks for having me. It's great to be here. Earthrise, when we began just a few years ago, looked into the data that was available and determined that the biggest gap really was in connecting the unbelievable amounts of data we have to users. And those users can range, of course, from the public all the way to policymakers and a number of parties in between for uses that are perhaps unlimited, based on the fact that, as Waleed, I think, well outlined in his earlier talk, the unique perspective of space offers us something that we cannot get otherwise. I named it Earthrise because, of course, connecting space to the Earth, that Earthrise photo that was taken by the Apollo 8 astronauts was the first look back we had in the mirror that really captured the public's attention. But I also sort of capitalized RISE because I worked at NASA, so you have to have acronyms, and RISE is a renaissance in sensing the environment. We have not only the new developments in sensor technologies and satellites, lower costs of launches and satellites, and all the new ways we have of storing and accessing data and modeling techniques. So we have had, I fully agree with this morning's premise, so much value to the climate change discussion we wouldn't even know about without our satellite constellations. But it's time for us to really figure out how to best utilize that data between resilience, things we can do to mitigate, and things that we can do to adapt. So for the public, we at Earthrise primarily work through journalists to tell stories. You know, no matter what, it's a local story, and the public around the planet needs to see and can see now from space what is changing in their own backyard. And I think Earthrise making that connection by seeding stories around the world to journalists who can then utilize the data within what is happening in their neck of the woods. So we utilize all the free government satellite data, but also have agreements with the private sector providers like Maxar and Planet and Airbus. So being able to add value added analysis and show the public what's happening so they can recognize and take action to prevent it is one aspect of this. We also reach students through teachers and allow them to access the data because, again, there is so much wonderful data out there from space, and they can build on their own tablets or phones a story that shows in their own backyard how climate has affected their own environment. Ultimately leading to policymakers, I think the major issue for policymakers is having people beyond sort of the agencies that create the data, like NASA, really recognize how they can utilize it and to be able to share that information. If we are to do what I think most people agree would be necessary to really address climate change, we have to be able to measure it more precisely, emissions in particular. And if we can do that, both with, I think, all the greenhouse gases, but we're starting to do that with methane and certainly with CO2, that you can have a monetization scheme that is built on something that is verifiable. So this would also work for trade agreements. And I think policy can be set if it's somewhat of a chicken or egg. I always thought, well, let's set the policies, and certainly the private sector will come along if the government's going to buy that data to be able to fulfill the needs. But it is also now a push and a pull, because right now we have organizations developing data that will inform policymakers so it can drive policy. So the technology is just an amazing renaissance where we are able to utilize more of the data, but we don't utilize it in a way that, as I think every single speaker has said already, is as meaningful as it can be. So if you are looking to, as an insurance company, you probably have found a way to get that information. You know, if there's a way to make money using this data, more and more people will do that. But in a policy sense, we really, I think, can do a better job, and at least this administration is working to do that. I will note that we often, one of the gaps I think in the policy world is NASA, for instance, think, well, we measure the climate, but we're not the ones who set policy to do anything about it. And then, you know, NOAA is an operational agency, and they are there to convey what's happening more on the operational side. And the hole in this, the gap, is who is going to analyze that data in order to influence policy. And I would go back to the 80s, where we had the determination by not just NASA, but other agencies of the ozone hole. But NASA scientists did help contribute to the ultimate recognition and solution. So recognizing that CFCs were contributing to the deterioration of the ozone hole led to them being banned through policy. And that's the feedback loop that we are trying to incentivize by people seeing that this data isn't just for science. There should be things that connect that data to actions that make a meaningful change. And that's what we're all about.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Laura, you hit on 2 points. One, you gave me a great lead in to Steve, just an organization that is actually seeking to do exactly what you're saying, which is address a very specific need within the community. But before I turn to him, I absolutely agree with you that I think sometimes we make the mistake when you're a geek and when you're a scientist. You know, build it and they will come. We're excited about the data. It shows us so much. And there's an absolute truth in that. But you really hit on the point that it's about building a chain of information. And it builds on what Marianne was saying about turning this into climate services, turning this into the ability to make decisions, and then motivating people to do so. Because I think, as we all unfortunately know, just because we know something doesn't mean something happens next. And so having the data is incredibly important, but then building out information and attitudes and services and interpretation, all of those things matter just as much. I think that was really a great overview. Steve, I'd like to turn to you next. You are engaged in some exciting new work by a non-governmental and non-commercial organization, essentially, as I understand it, custom designing a satellite to provide much needed climate data. In fact, just recently, Governor Newsom of California said of another related project that these homegrown satellites are a game changer. So I'd like for you to tell us about how that came to be, and especially what other possibilities you see in the future in this particular area.
Thanks so much, Crystal, and thanks for the great talks, and it's great to be here with these distinguished colleagues. So I think Lori set it up wonderfully. I describe it as we're trying to build the data to action pipeline. So what we need to do is not only have that intact pipe, but also fill it with high quality data. So MethaneSat is a satellite being built by MethaneSat LLC, which is a wholly owned subsidiary of the Environmental Defense Fund, a nonprofit. And what we're trying to do is to produce high quality, actionable data and fill the gaps that Lori described so that we can actually provide free of charge across the globe, highly resolved, spatially resolved, and fully quantified methane emissions data from the oil and gas industry, as well as hopefully agriculture, which we're still working on. The satellite will launch in 2022, late 2022, And it really, I think, is a game changer in really trying to think through, in a way, the reverse order. While Thelma talked about critically important scientists, as a scientist who's worked on climate change for many decades on the ground, and Marianne talked about adaptation, another essential piece. And Lori talked about how to build the civil society action. What we need, though, is increasing quantities of actionable data. And we have to start with what data do we need, and then work backwards to what technology will be required. And that's exactly what we did in the methane sac case. We didn't start with the technology. We started with what data is missing. And we started by using on-the-ground data collected intensively in the United States to say, what do we need to understand in order to map and quantify methane emissions from oil and gas industry? And why look at oil and gas? Because it represents a significant source of methane, and most people don't even recognize that methane accounts for more than a quarter of the warming we're experiencing today. And because it's a short-lived climate pollutant, roughly half of the warming we'll experience from emissions that are climate emissions from this year will be the result over the next 20 years. So excuse me, let me make that clear. So the impact of this year's greenhouse gas emissions over the next 20 years will be dominated by methane emissions. CO2 is a critically important greenhouse gas, which we have to reduce because that determines the long-term warming. But in the near term, if we want to slow the rate of warming, which is creating so much of the damages, we've got to reduce methane emissions. And oil and gas industry has demonstrated they have the technology and the ability to reduce those emissions. The IEA has shown that 75% of emissions can be reduced with existing technology, and roughly half of the emissions can be reduced at no net cost. So we have a great opportunity, but we don't have enough data. So we started with what specific data do we need? And then we went and said, can we measure it from space? Because ultimately, as everyone said, we need to do this across the globe, and the best place to do it is from space. That resulted in a partnership between a range of different groups in academia, former government employees, the government in New Zealand, as well as the commercial space industry. And we brought all of this expertise together to develop this capacity in relatively rapid time to create the most highly effective satellite. So it's the most precise satellite currently being built or planned to measure methane emissions from space. This will give us an unprecedented ability to see. But in addition to the data, we have to have the software that allows us to quantify those emissions. Generally, we see data on concentrations. Those don't easily correlate with quantification. So we are developing a fully automated inversion technique for the first time that allows us to map in near real time the total emissions. We believe that building these kinds of pipelines through collaborations across civil society, with government, with private sector, as well as with academics and NGOs, will allow us to greatly accelerate what we know, which will allow us to take action much more rapidly. We believe that is really a game changer. We think that we can make rapid progress by using this combination. And Lori spelled it out wonderfully of showing how traditionally we have siloed approaches, different agencies or groups responsible for individual segments of the problem. We really need to bring all of that together, create a pipeline, and fill it with high quality data, and give policymakers and civil society the data they need to take the action that's required to reduce the rate of warming over the near term and the long term. And only with that kind of dramatic action are we likely to be able to put off the most dramatic impacts of climate change, which we all fear.
It's a big, I mean, I think you're exactly right. And we know that. And so one thing I wanted to actually do was take a look at this word cloud that we put as our first poll. So we actually asked our audience to weigh in on sort of what is the first type of benefit they think of regarding satellites and climate change. And one of the most interesting things that I see in this, I know some of it's a little small for everybody to read, but some of the biggest words that got put in the most actually don't relate to super specific technology. They relate to the actions that you all have been discussing: observing, knowledge, measuring, monitoring, having a global view, having perspective. So I'd like to get all of your thoughts in terms of we've identified, I think, as a group, some of the important needs. But one of the things that I'd like to ask is about resources. So in his initial remarks, Waleed specifically brought up resources. And I wanted to ask you all of you to weigh in on any thoughts you have. Is the problem here money? Is this that we need more resources put to this problem? Or do you think that it's a lot more complex than that? So maybe, Lori, I'll start with you, and then anyone else who's interested can chime in. But I'd like your thoughts on, do we have enough resources to enact what you all are just describing?
Yeah, it's a great question, and resources can mean a lot of things, and I would never say we don't need more resources. I believe we could effectively double NASA's budget and utilize it very well, but it's an and, not a just do that. That wouldn't solve much, honestly. It is, as we were discussing, as Steve just said as well, a combination of users in the government, in the private sector, nonprofits, as well as global organizations. So as we're here, I'd love to hear from the IPCC, what do they really need? We have models, we have gaps because of data, we have gaps because people don't know about utilization, we have gaps that are stovepipes along pretty much every point. And I have found that both the government and the private sector want to do the right thing, but they don't talk to each other well or interact well. And I think the government really does want to do a better job, but the government doesn't speak with one voice and has a lot of priorities. So even the great emphasis we have in the Biden administration on addressing climate change, NASA wasn't even within the first dozen agencies they thought of to be on their climate policy team. So we really have a lot of work to do, and we can always use resources and money in other ways.
Thank you. I'll just kick it over to Thelma, and Lori has a great point, and then we'll go to Steve and Marianne. But what's your perspective on this at the IPCC, Thelma?
Yeah, obviously, I think I mentioned briefly in my intervention that at every assessment that comes every 6 years, so it's voluntary work of thousands of, I would say hundreds of authors coming from all over the world. And obviously, as I said, assessing models and using these models to improve or to reduce the uncertainty. So this is the real benefit that we have from one assessment to the other. It's not that we go wrong in one assessment. We can do better in the next because you are improving the accuracy of your models. You are inputting more data into the models to make them every time more reliable. So I think that from the point of view of the IPCC, obviously we rely a lot on the modeling community, and the modeling community relies on better and better data. So I see that, when we talk about the issue of the resources, obviously, as Laurie has said, the resources is always an issue, right? But this is why we see a lot of partnerships. Also, I think, Laurie, if you allow me, I have been in the remote sensing space agency for a long time and now retired. But at the beginning, 1982, the data was paid, Landsat data, not so many data available. And now through time, you see more and more data becoming available for people to use. And why do we say the importance of that is really so that everyone is equitable. Everyone could have a chance of getting the data, extracting information from that data to, as many have said, to inform policymakers for action. I don't know of a better example than the monitoring of the Brazilian Amazonia for the deforestation. And maintaining the consistency, and that's what important, the consistency of the data availability that allows us to every single year, wall to wall, to inform the government. Now, if that triggers action, at least the information is there. So from the point of view of the IPCC, that's what matters. Science is there. we inform, data is there. Now action should come from every single government. And that's what we are expecting from all governments in climate change. So it's really an important issue here. Resources availability, free access to data. And it's not only me saying that, a lot of communities saying the importance of free, accessible data to extract information to inform policymakers. Then it's up to them how to manage that. Yeah. I can't hear you.
Yeah, I agree, Thelma. I sit on the program board of the Group on Earth Observation that focuses on exactly this. And so sometimes it's not just about putting more money into new data, it's about how much we have access to and what we can do with that. And is there enough resources to access the data that is available? Steve, I'd like to get your thoughts on this topic.
Yeah, well, I think Thelma pointed out to two key things. So obviously, open access data is critically important. And while private sector is important, it doesn't replace that open access data. And the second one is policy relevant data. And the example in the Amazon is a fabulous one. But regrettably, much of the data that's collected is not policy relevant. And there's no mandate to make it policy relevant. So we really need to ensure that the funds that we do have lead to the full filling of that pipeline, and not just data for data's sake. And while that is harsh, I can say that I was an academic for most of my career. I've been doing academic research for a long time, for many decades. And I think we need a mandate to say that all of the data needs to lead there. That's not to say that basic research isn't important, but we haven't filled the gap and given that mandate to public spending. And we have to recognize, as we're doing with MethaneSat, that philanthropic investments is also critically important. We're able to make all the data for MethaneSat publicly available and to do all of this work in quick time by using philanthropic funding. So thus we're taking no corporate funding, and we do have government funding from New Zealand.
Great. So, Marianne, I'd like to hear your thoughts on this. As someone who is focused on climate services in Africa, what are your resource needs? Where are the areas where you think there is more need for funding or other resources? Marianne?
Oh, I barely hear you. Thank you. Sorry, I was breaking up, but I was going to come up to resources before my internet breaks up. I think that resources are very important. It depends just on where you are sitting in the world. In Africa, having access to the data, and I would even add infrastructure, is capital. And I say that it is even the main challenge, and I would put it under the budget constraint of the National Meteorological and Hydrological Services, which we're having very limited yearly resources. So it's important, and it is even well highlighted in the African Ministerial Conference on Meteorology, which is working very hard with the African Union Commission to increase the political support to national med services and ensure that climate services are adequately delivered. And in this delivery, I think that all of the value chain of the climate services needs to be strengthened. So data, access to data, being aware to the data, getting the infrastructure to process those data are really key for Africa. Thank you.
Thank you, Marianne. That actually takes us to some of our audience questions, which are starting to roll in. So a reminder to everyone, if you'd like to ask this panel or any of our panels, you can click on the link at the bottom of the live stream. I'm excited. I think one of the first questions that has already gotten some upvotes in our voting people from the audience is related to exactly what Marianne was just talking about. So I'd like to see if anyone else has any comments on it. So starting with this question, do policymakers know how important satellites are for tackling climate change? And if not, what can we do to improve that awareness? And I'd like to add, I think this is a great question, because I think to a certain extent, the answer is yes, but not entirely. And so all of you have interacted with government in different ways. I'd like to hear your thoughts on what we can do to improve the understanding among non-scientist policymakers that this data and this information is there. So Thelma, I saw you nodding. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, exactly as you say. They all know, but not everything. So all the very technical issues that I put forward from Working Group 1, most likely, the governments do not know into depth, the implications of these measurements and these models and so on. What do governments know more readily? They more readily know about land use change. So that's my assessment, because of inventories, because of submissions to the UNFCCC, like, forest changes, like degradation, deforestation. So they are more interested or know more about the importance of remote sensing to assess these changes in land use and the implications of that. So I would say that is the number one for governments, I would say. And then, others will build up their knowledge depending on how is their surrounding in terms of technical people, making them knowledgeable of the increases in CO2, in CH4, as Steve has said. I don't think that many governments know about the CH4, Steve. Although we do have satellites already that measure that. But I think that one of the implications, and just, Crystal, to finalize, is really, remotely sensed data cannot separate the implications from anthropogenic actions in natural variability. So many governments put that, in front, saying, well, maybe this is not really, because of anthropogenic actions or measures, but they come from natural variability. That, for instance, is the case for fires. Just to give one example.
So let me jump in, because Thelma, I think is right, though I'm going to suggest that, in fact, what we need to do is ask the policymakers what data they need to create effective policy, and then make sure we have it. Because in most cases, we do not have the data that's why I call it policy relevant data. Not at all, some. And where I would maybe disagree a little with Thelma is that I think we do have the capacity for many types of sources of greenhouse gases to separate anthropogenic from human-caused, from natural emissions. Now, there are some tough places, absolutely, where they're mingled, makes it very hard. But we can do a lot better than we have by building instruments to provide the data needed by the policymakers with a deliberate mind to that and not the science. And as a scientist, I did most of my career thinking about what do I need for science? Very important. We need to turn that around. What do we need to help humanity address the problems and build the tools to give that data in addition? We have done a terrible job, I would argue, at that. And I think that what we can do, certainly what we found in methane, is the tools were out there and were not being deployed. And we needed to start we need to run from the pipeline the opposite way. What do we need for policymakers? Then back up to the data and the technology. And I think what we'll do is we'll see a rapid acceleration in the usefulness, the recognition of the power of remote sensing in just a few years. We have all the tools. We just need to put them together and create a new generation of satellites that are much more policy relevant.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And it's impossible to separate out scientists doing things for science and then the incredible need that we have as a society right now. And it's always going to be both, that this is one area where changing our frame, or at least adding that frame of trying to think of it from the other direction, is really key, particularly when it comes to making useful data. Lori, did you want to chime in on this one?
Only to emphasize the point. I could not agree more. And NASA has science and applications, but the applications part's really tiny and really not starting with the end state user in mind. Well, the end state user is and has been that researcher to what Steve used to be, and we need to transition to policymakers outside of just the domain of studying Earth as a system, and in addition to doing that, be able to identify users so we can develop to their needs. It's not something NASA likes to do. I guess I would ask Steve if this, even for me, 10 years ago, I was frustrated at NASA's insistence on sticking with the exact decadal plan for Earth sciences, and it would take 30 years to fly it all out with these big missions that were not based on any of the applications that were current. And in talking to Barry and Moore, who at the time had led the Earth Science Decadal Report, and now Waleed followed with the next decadal report, they both acknowledged that things in Earth sciences change faster, so that the investments probably can't be decided that far in advance. Those work for astronomy, for instance. Steve, do you think that is something we could do differently?
Absolutely. And again, it's an and, right? So I am not in any way pushing back against science. That would be against my whole training and background and most of my career. Right. But we need to exactly be nimble. And that's where I have to credit the folks that we brought in from commercial space. They knew how to be nimble in a way, but that wasn't sufficient. We also needed the best leading academics, which we brought in. We have two great institutions in Harvard and the Smithsonian Astrophysical Observatory as key partners. It was bringing all of that together. Historically, we've not brought all those sectors together. The policymakers. So on our team, we have a whole series of people who do nothing but interact with the policymakers so we can get that input, right? What do they need? What does the finance community need? What do all these different communities need? We need to have that voice there, and not just, I've worked with Barry and over many years, a lot of great scientists, but you need other types of voices when we do these reviews, and they can't be decadal or multi-decadal. They have to be both long-term and near-term. And that, just like the climate problem, we have a near-term problem and a long-term problem, and it's a big and. We got to solve both.
That's a great point.
It is all about implementing effectively the global climate framework services. As I said in the beginning, it's defining who needs the data, what for. Policymakers, users, and that can be done through a user interface platform. So implementing the global climate services, either at national level or regional level, is a key point.
Absolutely. I'd like to, this is such a fascinating topic, but I also want to give our audience a chance to ask more questions. And I think the next one is really interesting. So the question is, in the past few years, young climate activists have made global headlines. What can young space professionals do, or any space professional for that matter, do to boost the utilization of space systems for climate change and action? And so I think a way of rewording this is, we've been talking about all these different end users. This is a really interesting group. Does anyone have any thoughts on, as a public, what about these young people who are really pushing for action, in some cases making a lot of progress? Is there a way that we can try to connect space data to them?
I have a concept that I put out in a couple of ways that I'll just outline quickly, which is a climate data core, or something like Biden has proposed, and I think he's having both the Interior Department and the Agriculture Department lead it. But I think NASA, NOAA, USGS could play a role, because young people need to be well versed in reading satellite data and interpreting it. And if you put people into training who do this, or have people coming out of academia who have this ability, they can go into local communities across the United States, but hopefully the world, more like Peace Corps, to work with the decision makers on the local level. We understand the impacts of this are local, at least for adaptation and resilience. And to me, there are so many people coming, my kids are in their 20s, who this should and is their number one priority, and they would sign up to do some kind of service corps, and space needs to play a role. Our data can be utilized better if we put people out who are trained, who can connect that information to people who really need it.
Yeah. Steve, do you have any thoughts on this? You work at a university, you work with the university as part of your project. I'm just curious if it's something you all have considered.
Yeah, so certainly we try, and there is a lot of younger folk part of our project through universities. But I think also, satellites bring one set of data. They're not the only source of data. And there's a lot of on-ground truthing. There's a lot of remote sensing, more visible spectrum mapping, because one of the key things is you need to be able to understand what is where on a global basis. We don't have those kind of global maps. So I think there's, to Lori's point, just a whole host of ways to interact. What we have to do is also be realistic. And, there's some of this is highly technical and requires a fairly sophisticated math. And there are fabulous young people who can do it, but it isn't something that the average 18-year-old or even the average 25-year-old can do. So we need to basically create a menu of options for people to get involved. I think they exist there. There are lots of organizations utilizing a range of citizen science as well as advanced computing. And we see it in the data science world where we have all kinds of competitions that take advantage of younger generations' commitment.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you're right that it's not everything, right? But there's an opportunity for visualization here and outreach that doesn't fit into our usual paradigm of governments and scientists. And so trying to think of what we turn data into in certain circumstances for that outreach, I think has a real possibility there. I'd like to move on to one more audience question. I think I'll have Marianne maybe take this one first. So we've talked a lot about satellite data here, but that's not the only data source. So this person was asking, is there a need for the space community to develop more interactions with other sources of climate data? So Thelma or Marianne, I'd love to hear from you on this one.
Sure. I think that we need to mix up these long series of satellite data with in situ data and any other data that can allow the computation of climate records to study climate change. I can give the example of Copernicus Climate Change Service, which is very useful, but the African users need to be aware of those data to be able to develop their capacity to access them, use them, and process them for their own needs. UMaxSat, I think, have been organizing lots of series of webinars, but there are other satellite providers whose data can be of interest. And the African community need to be aware of that. So we need to really do some awareness campaign so that those youngsters and other users have access to them. And what is very good and very promising is that many satellite operators are working together. So the coordination group of the meteorological satellite, CGMS, and the Committee of Earth Observation Satellite, COS, working group on climate monitoring to produce good climate data records without gaps. So I'm very excited about the new generation of satellites that are coming, as they will offer tremendous atmospheric and atmospheric composition data, as well as surface, ocean data with a much better spatial and temporal resolution. And I think that this will, in the long run, offer better climate data records with a much higher resolution that will enable better knowledge of local climate change and local adaptation.
Thank you. Thelma, what do you think about how the space community interacts with other data sources?
Well, it's essential. I would say that, if you take, for instance, remotely sensed data as an example, to assess land use change, right? And then you would need some data, in-field, ground data, to validate your satellite data. That's essential. Depending on the classifier that you're going to use to extract the information, it has to be trained to do that. And training means that you would input data that you have collected elsewhere. So field data is essential here. Ice core data. So we are talking about a whole set of other data sets that really feed into the system. And it was really interesting because when we didn't have, for instance, satellite data to look at the concentration of CO2 versus all other gases, and when they came up to into reality, you see how much they fit into previous observations. So that gives a much more, let's say, confidence to governments that you are putting together a whole set of data coming from different and independent sources that obviously add to the reliability of what you're talking about. So it's essential, I would say, it's essential to have diverse sets.
Yeah, I just want to emphasize that. I mean, I think there's some wonderful programs like IGUS at WMO, so I'll plug Mary Ann's wonderful institution, as well as now at UNEP, starting the International Methane Emissions Observatory, which is trying to link all these data, bring them together in a way that allows us to create, because they give you very different perspectives. Totally agree with Thelma. It's absolutely critical for validation. You need this kind of data, but there are, on the methane front, there are hundreds and hundreds of scientists, literally many, many hundreds, collecting field data that absolutely creates a granularity that we're well away from being able to ever produce with remote sensing. And so they're complementary. They also provide the capacity building around the globe as these studies occur in a diversity of nations where you have good science, but maybe hadn't worked on it. And it's really that combination that gives us the confidence, against Thelma's point. And there are institutions that are working across these different scales, and we need to support those.
Absolutely. So I'll be honest, I could continue this conversation forever. We have more great questions coming in from the audience, but we have to end on time. So I want to close with one opportunity for sort of one final comment here, and maybe kind of give 30-second to a minute answers to just say, you know, this isn't a new problem. I mean, I'm really excited about everything we've talked about. I think the opportunities are amazing. But, you know, there's also concern that we're not taking action fast enough, and that, you know, as we talked about with young people, they're very concerned for a very good reason. You know, we have the focus on the UN Sustainable Development Goals and whether we're going to reach those in this area. And so I'd like to close with just an opportunity for you to say, you know, 30 seconds of what do you think the most important form of action that we could take in this area in, say, the next 10 years are? If you could sort of tell governments or academia or the commercial industry one thing that you think that they should do, you know, what would that be? Steve, I might start with you because I suspect I might know the answer, but I'm curious what you have to say, and then we'll just go around the panel.
Yeah, so, well, as I mentioned, we need to reduce methane emissions dramatically. It can slow the rate of warming incredibly quickly, which will reduce damages. But and related to that is, I think we need, as the satellite community needs to think about, as I said before, what data does the policy community need? And we have to ask them, and then we have to go out and produce them in the next few years, so that a decade from now, we have a picture of what's happening that we've never had before. And I think that's a game changer.
Absolutely. Lori, what about you?
I think the greatest gap is in leadership. To me, it does take people around the world in senior positions who show real leadership and stand up to and recognize what we now know is happening, how we can get even more of that information and make decisions that will be impactful from that data. In the US, I believe that NASA could take a much larger role. I think NASA was formed to address what the US at the time envisioned as a global crisis, and they stepped up to it, and they could do more now. But there needs to be greater coordination in the US government for managing the data as part of the greater issue.
Great, thank you. Thelma, what about you? If you were king for a day, what would you tell everyone to do?
I'm gonna do bullet wise. So Lori was right when she said we need leadership, and also we need to recognize that different governments and have different capacities to implement, climate responses like adaptation, mitigation. So my bullet point is leadership, as Lori has said. We need international cooperation. That's fundamental, and IPCC recognizes that. We need partnerships in terms of research, in terms of technology transfer, capacity building. We need improved governance, both international governments for some of the research issues that are necessary, and also national government, strengthening of institutions. So, and moreover, I think that governments are lacking to look at climate change and the opportunities to address this, to limit climate change, the opportunities in so many areas. I think they are looking more from the negative side in terms of how much this is going to cost, etc. But they are not looking at the benefits and the opportunities before addressing, climate change and limiting global warming. So I would say that these are my main points.
Great, thank you. And Marianne, what are your thoughts?
Telma nearly said it all, but I would say a win-win partnership, really, and cooperation to transfer technology that enable access to data, all data, including satellite, all data, and have the infrastructure. This is very important in Africa to process the products that users need, both policymakers and local users.
Thank you. So we are about to head to our break, but before I do that, I just want to say thank you to Lori, Steve, Thelma, and Marianne. This has been an amazing conversation. And honestly, I hope it's not the first. I admit when we built our agenda, we were really thinking about changes that had happened in the world in the last year, in the United States government, and just really trying to say, okay, well, what can we talk about that will help people understand? In the space world, we often talk about the value of satellites and we assume their value, but I really wanted to dig into where are the opportunities and the gaps and what could we do to do even more. And I think we've done that today. So thank you all so much for being here, for being an amazing kickoff for our Summit for Space Sustainability. And yeah, thank you so much. I really appreciate your time today. For now, we're going to go to the break. We will be back at 10:30, everyone, and I'm really excited. We will be having a panel on megaconstellations. So if you have any questions at all, please reach out to us. In the meantime, enjoy your short break. Hi, everybody. Welcome back to the third annual Summit for Space Sustainability. We are now going to turn to our next panel, Megaconstellations. The train has left the station. Now what? To get that train rolling, we'll hear a spotlight talk from Timibe Aganabe, an assistant professor in the School for Future of Innovation in Society at the Arizona State University. She'll share some thoughts on the potential consequences and opportunities for megaconstellations.
According to the United Nations Office of Outer Space Affairs, over 11,000 space objects have been launched and recorded in their online index. But this number is set to increase significantly as private companies and governments intend to launch tens of thousands of satellites into low Earth orbit, known as megaconstellations. This trend is driven by the reduced cost of hardware and launch and the increased demand for low latency, high broadband internet to underserved locations. While US companies like Amazon, Canada's Telesat, and UK's OneWeb propose megaconstellation satellites in the order of the low thousands, US-based SpaceX alone has announced plans to launch 42,000 satellites as part of its Starlink project. If this happens, SpaceX will be responsible for a 5-fold increase in the number of satellites launched by all of humanity. Of those 42,000, they plan to have 11,926 launched in orbit by 2027. Also importantly, as the European Commission is currently studying the feasibility of a European-owned space-based communication system, and the Chinese government has created a company dedicated to creating and operating a 13,000 satellite broadband constellation, the soft power political and security element is also present, much as we see with global navigation. This means that some actors may enter this vertical even if the business case is not evident. One of the big questions is, does servicing this increased demand warrant all the increased risks to and in low Earth orbit, the atmosphere, and on Earth? COVID-19 showed us the extent of the digital divide problem. Those connected were able to maintain business or find new opportunities and continue their education. Those who were not, whether in rural areas, indigenous communities, or in developing countries, found themselves further marginalized. This leads some to question whether there is a right to be connected. While low Earth orbit is not the only way to be connected, proponents argue that it is cheaper and faster, and this serves to bring many of the world's population into the 21st century. But should this goal be met at all costs? The astronomy community were one of the first communities to raise the alarm in a significant way about the risk posed to their activities by the brightness of satellite constellations, namely that the constellations cause streaks, diffuse background light, and cause radio noise that may prevent access to the sky. Essentially, two proposed rights are pushing against each other, the right to be connected versus the right to a dark and quiet sky. The space industry argues that there is no hierarchy to space activities, and everyone is free to explore space, subject only to the Outer Space Treaty. But as Article 1 of the Outer Space Treaty highlights, the freedom of outer space is subject to the condition that space be explored and used for the benefit and in the interests of all countries. In this case, what is benefit and who gets to decide? We must promote dialogue to ensure that space activities are and continue to be beneficial for all of humanity. Untracked debris is also a big risk, as this could lead to potentially dangerous in-orbit collisions on a regular basis. Other less known risks include that satellite reentries could deposit more aluminium into Earth's upper atmosphere, and the cumulative impact of thousands of rocket stages on the ocean's environment could be significant should these stages contain hazardous materials. But should we still be concerned, as some operators seem to be listening? According to Telesat's CEO, operators are following best practices regarding how to deal with debris and are designing satellites to minimize debris, protect the space environment, and are launching into the lowest orbit so that troubled satellites can decay quickly. And in response to astronomy concerns, SpaceX has been meeting with the astronomy community regularly and are innovating around a coating called DarkSat and a sunshade to address the brightness of satellites. The issue is, can we rely on the good faith of these actors? And some argue that what they're doing does not go far enough. For instance, in recent times, the news has reported controversy involving close approaches between a Starlink satellite and OneWeb satellites and the European Space Agency, where coordination did not work well. With no space traffic management system or global space situational awareness capability, we may hear more of these issues. So what do we do next? The International Astronomical Union has now decided to take the issue of light pollution to the United Nations Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, requesting that they protect the night's darkness for the sake of advancements in astronomy. But astronomers are just one stakeholder. Mechanisms will be needed to balance interests and encourage coordination. Bowley and Byers argue in the recent edition of Nature journal that to address the myriad of concerns that will affect all communities, international cooperation is urgently needed, along with a regulatory system that takes into account the effects of thousands of satellites, including action for improved space situational awareness, improved communication between operators, and internationally adopted right-of-way rules.
All right, excellent. Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, or time-appropriate greeting for where you're at. My name is Chris Johnson. I'm the Space Law Advisor at the Secure World Foundation. This panel now deals with megaconstellations. After this, the first panel was very focused on terrestrial matters. We're now leaving the terrestrial domain and we're looking at the space domain. I really think that, Timmy's introduction and her framing video puts out a lot of the issues that are at play. The fact that we have these competing and legitimate uses. We have the use of the space domain for megaconstellations and all the benefits that they offer. But we have these other legitimate uses of the space domain, like optical astronomy, and the fact that there's these real challenges for space traffic management and space situational awareness. Luckily, we do have a panel with us who can really get into some of these issues. I don't think we're going to find any perfect solutions, but at least we're going to be able to highlight and elucidate some of these issues. Joining me on my panel first is Tim Farrar. Tim is the president of Telecom Media and Finance Associates, his own consulting firm based in Menlo Park, California, which specializes in the technical and financial analysis of wireless and satellite ventures. Tim has over 25 years of consulting experience across the telecom and satellite industries, having worked for leading technical and strategy consultants in both the US and the UK. Mr. Farrar, thank you for joining us this morning. Next, we have Professor Hugh Lewis. Hugh is the head of Astronautics Research Group at the University of Southampton in the UK and has been working in the fields of space debris and space sustainability for over 20 years. He is a member of the UK Space Agency delegation to the Interagency Space Debris Coordination Committee, the IADC, and is the chair of their working group too on modeling. He is also currently a member of the Royal Astronomical Society subgroup assessing the impacts of satellite megaconstellations on optical astronomy. Professor Lewis, thank you for joining us as well. Next, we have Randy Siegel. Randy is a partner at the law firm Hogan Lovells and has over 18 years of in-house general counsel experience. Her work focuses on satellite, wireless, drone, and technology transactions. Randy's transactional and advisory experience has brought her throughout North and South America, Europe, Asia, and the Middle East, and on the most complex of international programs and legal issues. Randy, thank you so much for joining us. And last but not least is Andy Williams. Mr. Williams is the External Relations Officer at the European Southern Observatory, where he supports strategic relations with current and future member states, the European Union, and international organizations such as the UN. Prior to joining the European Southern Observatory, he worked as a senior policy advisor for NATO and as a physicist for the UK government. So first, I'd like to speak with Mr. Farrar. Tim, in that spotlight talk that we all just heard, Tim introduced this idea that there are tens of thousands of satellites that are predicted, that are likely to be launched and enter into operation in the space domain, largely from the US, Canada, Europe, and likely as well China. Do these predictions seem to make sense to you from an economics and business standpoint? Maybe if you have some perspectives on that. And is there really a market to support some of these plans? So, Tim, over to you.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, I mean, just in terms of a bit of personal history, I 25 years ago, I worked on a lot of the big LEO projects back then, ICO, Globalstar, Iridium, Teledesic for many years, and then saw the aftermath of that with the many years of bankruptcy and litigation over the collapse of a lot of those projects. So, that sort of colors my perspective that, while it's very true to say there could be tens of thousands of satellites launched, if you go back 25 years, the predictions that people were making back then was that everyone's phone would have a satellite capability in it, that there would be tens or even hundreds of billions of dollars spent on satellite broadband within a decade. And it just didn't happen because the economics didn't work out. And now, here we are 20 years later, and sadly, I'd say a lot of people have forgotten the lessons of the 1990s. These things come around 10 years later or 20 years later when everyone's retired and forgotten about it. But we still face a lot of the same challenges. Yes, the technology is advanced, but the technology is advanced in terrestrial even faster than it has in satellite over the last 2 decades. And, it's still really unclear. So I think what I'm concerned about is that we see lots of statements about how awful everything will be with 40,000 satellites from SpaceX or 100,000 satellites from all the different companies combined, because people look at what is filed with the ITU, what is filed with the FCC. And, people make filings to stake out a position because they can only sort of step back from it later. They can't move forward and add even more satellites at a later date and keep the same priorities that they had. So, I guess my question for people like Hugh will be, okay, great, it may be terrible with 40,000 satellites, but what's the real, if we take some sort of real rational point of view that maybe there's only 4,000 or 5,000 satellites that get launched, and even that requires a lot of money to be invested over the next 5 to 10 years, which may or may not be available, or who knows what's going to happen to the financial markets. But is the situation a complete crisis and disaster with, let's say, 4,000 or 5,000 satellites, or do we, is it really only with 40,000 or 50,000 satellites that becomes a problem? So that's that's what I'd like to hear from some of the other panelists is, let's take some sort of what we view as rational. Let's say SpaceX is saying already we can't launch the V-band satellites because there aren't any terminals, and propagation is terrible and everything else. So let's focus on what people's concrete near-term plans are. And if that's a terrible situation, then please tell us, because that's going to need a lot more urgent action than worrying about something that probably will never happen to the tune of 40,000 or 50,000 satellites.
Yeah, I like that. Thank you. Those are good questions for Hugh. Hugh, yeah, the predictions right now, like he said, people are really worried about 40,000, 50,000 satellites, but what if it's only a fifth of that? Before you answer that, though, I really want to know, the challenges for Megaconstellations that they pose to SSA and space traffic management and the debris issue, whether it's at the this higher number that is possible or possibly a lower level. What do Megaconstellations mean for space traffic management and our awareness of the domain?
Thanks very much, Chris. That's a really good question. I'm going to thank Tim later for setting me up with actually quite a tricky question to answer as well. So a lot really depends on the attitude that these operators are going to take into the space environment. We've run computer simulations which can show really big impact on the space environment if the operator is perhaps not as advanced in their stewardship of the environment, or we can see, for the same number of satellites for a very similar type of setup, actually a rather benign situation. So we're kind of beholden really to the attitudes and the approaches that these operators take, both in terms of the impact on the orbital debris environment, but also in terms of space traffic management. It's not necessarily been a great start If we look at the particular encounters that SpaceX, for example, have had with the Starlink constellation, quite public events that have enabled us to really get some insight into the challenges, and it hasn't been great, to be perfectly honest. And a lot needs to change going into the future to ensure that we don't run into even worse problems with respect to the space traffic management concerns and the orbital debris concerns as well. But I think there are some very good and very positive signs coming from the operators in terms of how they intend to operate. I think it's really just a matter of making sure that they actually stick to those kind of things.
Well, I mean, I'll ask a more pointed question. How worried are you on some of these issues now? How worried would you be if they, only deploy and put into operation a fifth or a third of what they predict and what they aspire to? And how worried would you be if they really, really roll out everything and really get everything working on orbit? A true global constellation, a mega constellation. What does that really look like?
So, to be honest, I'm really worried, really, no matter the number of satellites that we're talking about, because we're really into unprecedented territory, and it's being driven not by governments that tend to move in very slow fashion. It's being driven by companies and companies that aim to disrupt the market, and they're doing the same thing in the space environment. So if you take, for example, this fail fast, fail often kind of mantra that is often associated with companies like SpaceX, potentially others as well, it's really about short-termism. It's not necessarily focused on the long-term issues. It's a philosophy that sets up the idea that there's no problem that you can't overcome, and you just iterate through those problems. So it works fantastically well for things like failures of components on rockets or on spacecraft. But when you're hit with societal issues and challenges, it really doesn't work well at all. And orbital debris is one of those issues. Same thing with the astronomy issues as well. And really, those companies aren't set up. They're a little bit naive in that sense. They don't necessarily have the foresight to be able to solve those problems in advance. They actually deliver almost test satellites onto orbit and then wait for problems to occur and then fix them quickly and fly a new satellite. And that doesn't work. And that really leads me to worry quite a lot about the impact that these constellations can have in the environment.
Yeah, I mean, we run into that quite often where, new users of the space domain think that they're the only or the first users of the space domain, and it just is not necessarily so. Thank you for that. We might have to come back to you. I want to now go to Randy and talk about a little bit about the regulatory environment, the approval environment. Randy, what does it look like? What does the regulatory environment look like for mega constellations? Or, you can use whatever term you want if you want to call it, global systems or global constellations. What does that type of approval process look like? And where are we at on the regulatory front? Unless she can't hear us, in which case we'll have to come back.
Thank you.
Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
I'm so glad that Tim.
Yeah, we hear you. Go ahead.
I just wanted to start off by saying, Tim, thank you for having the memory that I do, going back to the 90s and Teledesic and all the mega constellations then. But I will tell you that this is different. Back in the 90s when this happened, we always thought that they must know what they're doing, right? These smart companies must know what they're doing, led by smart money, and there has to be something there. It was too early for its times. I will tell you, a lot of things that are happening now are very different in feeling than they were in the 90s. I genuinely believe that this is real. It doesn't matter to me whether it's 40,000 or whether it's 30,000 or 20,000. I think that SpaceLink and Kuiper are real. I think the Chinese will be going up with their mega constellations. We have so many other, 100 to 1,000 constellations that are in existence as well. And the issues on light pollution, the issues on the environmental issues with aluminum particles from small sat launches, and the issues of orbital debris are real. With launching every 3
Seems like she might get
5 years.
cut up a little bit. Randy, we'll come back to you. I want to quickly go to Andy at ESO to really talk about the challenges for ground-based astronomy, optical astronomy. What does it look like now, and what are your predictions for the near term? And honestly, this issue really developed rapidly over the last couple of years. It's not like it took us by surprise, but it really came up on us fast. So if you could tell us a little bit about that, educate us on the effects on your profession.
Sure. So I just want to start out by saying, thanks for the invite and for considering astronomy as one of the stakeholders now in this issue of Megaconstellations. So I just want to reflect on Tim's question, which he put to us, and just note that astronomy observatories, have lifetimes of 30 or more years. So we have to plan long term, and we can only act on the basis of formal government plans, such as the ITU filings. So, even though it might be the case that not all the filings are realistic, I mean, these are the things that we have to base our assumptions on for planning for the long term. So if we consider the main projects in development, we can expect several thousand satellites overhead at any one time. And particularly just before sunrise and just after sunset, most of them will be illuminated by the sun and potentially detectable by a telescope. So if you live in a city, you might not notice anything unless you know exactly where to look. But if you go to a dark sky area, you will see tens or even hundreds of moving objects in the sky. And this is a change to this beautiful landscape, which is one of the few natural wonders that is accessible to every single person on the planet. And I really believe that the international community has to consider this. So from the perspective of astronomical science, well, the impact is really depending on the interaction between the telescope and the constellation system. So the basic impacts depend on the number of satellites, the size of the telescope, and the orbital altitude of the satellites, which is a very important factor. And overall, the impacts range from quite minor to some of the large narrow field telescopes that are looking at a very small patch of the sky to very severe for those facilities that need to do their science at twilight when there's more visible satellites. And for wide field telescopes that are looking at a large portion of the sky. So the largest of these at the moment is the Vera Rubin Observatory, and they're facing many percentage of images ruined, and almost every single image having a satellite trail in the early hours of the night. So they're facing substantial extra cost to achieve their defined science goals. And you're right that this issue kind of really took us by surprise, and our satellites have always been a problem. But I think the root of the issue here is that none of our environmental laws directly address the visual appearance or even the general sustainability of the space environment, and the optical spectrum is not managed in any way. So there's no regulation to compel space actors to take action or for governments to set a level playing field of rules. If we consider the radio side, okay, there are thousands of objects that are now transmitting, and radio observatories were able to observe outside the slim portion of the spectrum that's protected by finding a local radio quiet zone, which offers greater protection. But the issue is that these radio quiet zones can't offer any protection from space-based transmissions. So we're going to have this problem of just much more background noise from these thousands of new antennas in the sky and the electronic noise that's coming from the satellites. So we've been working with the community, we've been working with the industry, And I can go into more of those aspects later, if you like.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, listen, we have a lot of students that are also attending. If you can recommend any kind of background or document or something that summarizes many of these issues, please feel free to share it. But my question also is, well, actually, hold on. You said satellites are always a problem. Satellites have always been a problem. Is that true? That even if it was just a few satellites, that caused problems for astronomy?
Yeah. So for radio astronomers, I mean, they know now that there's this big arc across the sky, which is the geostationary belt, where there are satellites in there, and essentially in certain frequencies they just have to avoid this area. Satellites have been a problem from the optical side. I mean, already the Hubble Space Telescope is getting some percentage of its frames affected by streaks. But in general, the impact scales with the number of satellites. So just in the past 2 years, we've seen a 2,000 new additional objects added. So the problem is increasing rapidly. And if you look at the projections, I mean, we could see 100,000 new objects looking at the ITU filings, and then this is getting into some serious impacts.
All right, and I mean, are you coordinating with the folks like the space situational awareness folks and the space debris folks? Because you both have, I don't want to say grievances, but you both have issues that are talking about the same actors, the same users. You both have problems with the mega constellation operators. So is there some type of coordination already happening?
Yeah, so the astronomy community has formed several national working groups, and also we have a group that's under the auspices of the International Astronomical Union. And as part of these groups, we've invited experts in space situational awareness. So Hugh is a member of the UK Royal Astronomical Society group that's looking at this. And of course, this is important because part of the solution to the issue for astronomy, part of the solution is about finding ways to compel industry to share data on the trajectories of the satellites, predictions for the future. And of course, this is something that will also help the space situational awareness question. So I'd say this collaboration is just starting to emerge, but I think that a direction where we need to go in the future is to really work more closely together between these two communities.
Okay. At the top of our panel, we had a poll for folks to weigh in on some of the topics. If we can bring up the results of that poll, and we might have to revisit the poll near the end of at the end of the panel. So let's see. We asked the attendees, are the predictions about mega constellations numbering in the tens of thousands of operational satellites in the next decade overestimating, about right, or underestimating? So it seems that they might be agreeing with Tim. Almost half say that they're overestimating. So, all right, it makes sense that if you say you're going to launch or you aspire to launch tens of thousands and 40, 50,000 satellites, you might be overestimating it. But let's say 34% says they're about right. I think that I wanted to highlight that. But even if it's not exactly what we're going to meet, it seems like we're still going to have some of these issues. A lot of these issues. I think it's important to not frame it as one side versus the other, or a binary operators versus optical astronomers, or operators versus those who are worried about space debris and SSA. Does that make sense? Is there a way to not have this be totally a clash of legitimate uses? Anyone that wants to weigh in on that, how do we not make it a clash? Oh, and I see Randy has joined us back again. Good. Randy, we said
how do we not make it a clash? Okay, well, my internet is working. This is why we need the mega constellation, so there's better internet as well.
Yeah.
I think that as it's not just commercial versus the astronomers and the orbital debris. I think we have to work on this together. We have to work because the internet, you see what happened in countries and with people who didn't have internet during the COVID crisis and everything else. This is something that really the world does need. in terms of having the satellite connectivity. The challenge is how to do it at the same time that the orbital debris in particular doesn't cause issues for destroying, like the plastic in the oceans and everything else. This is a global issue. And how do we have coordination with mega constellations being launched by folks like China if we're not communicating with them? These are global issues, although the US is ahead of all the other countries in terms of launches that it's flagging. This is a global problem that we have. And while a treaty, United Nations type of process is not going to keep up with, as we've learned over the years, is not going to keep up with the rapidity of that's going on with advances, there's got to be some kind of a forum compromise that allows for remedies and doing the best thing as a global citizen, because space is for everybody. And if we do it wrong, we're going to create a problem that's going to be the gift that gives for eternity.
Responses. Go ahead, you.
Yeah, thanks. Randy's absolutely right. So thanks very much, Randy. I'm glad to have you back. One of the biggest issues that we have is that these mega constellations are regulated at a national level, and there is very little coordination that takes place between the regulators. So we can have a decision that's taken place in the US about a mega constellation there, and we can have a decision that's made in the UK or elsewhere in the world, and there's no sense that the combined effect of those two constellations going into orbit is being considered by either of those regulators. So we have that knowledge, we have the capability to make those kind of assessments, but there isn't any forum where that can be addressed and where the regulatory aspects can actually be sorted out.
Andy, can European Southern Observatory is an observer at COPUOS, and they just wrapped up, well, actually, it was a while ago, they did the Scientific and Technical Subcommittee. Can you give us, were these discussions held at the international level at COPUOS, and any results, or what's going to happen next?
Yeah, so I think the sort of issue here that has been touched on, I mean, the astronomy community is engaging with the industry, and the industry are engaging with us, and this is much appreciated. And some companies have made substantial changes to the designs of their satellites, like SpaceX, and we're having the situation of bilateral agreements, non-disclosure agreements between single observatories and companies. And okay, we can do this with 5, but can we do it with 10? What are the other countries going to do? So it's just something that becomes unsustainable. And I think what we need is a global approach to this. So that's why the IAU works on this and made the first approach to UN COPUOS, as you said, at the Science and Technical Subcommittee. And we made a set of recommendations that, amongst other things, set some basic requirements to mitigate damage to astronomy, to protect the night sky, to encourage governments to regulate on the matter, and to create a norm of cooperation and consultation with the astronomy community over space activities. So, in the discussion that happened at COPUOS, I was really pleased to see that many countries recognize the value of astronomy and the concerns that we have. But, the problem in this system, it's so complex. It's linked to many other very, very difficult issues, such as the allocation of slots for low Earth orbit, or the ideas such as a carrying capacity for low Earth orbit, and all the problems with space sustainability in general. That's sort of there was a sense that no country could really kind of take a firm stake and say, right, we're going to adopt these recommendations. So, we got the, I think it was what we were expecting, which was basically carry on working, carry on studying the issue, and report back next year. So, okay, I mean that's a first step. But in this year, another 1,000 or 2,000 satellites are going to be launched.
Can I just jump in here to something, to what Andy said? So one of the regulatory requirements, not for the geospatial satellites, remote sensing, but for the connected broadband satellites, is you have to get landing rights in countries. So even though, for example, the United States is the one that flags the constellations from the US or the UK for OneWeb, etc., you still need landing rights to go into countries. I think that that is a potential strategic negotiating leverage point, other than just being good corporate citizens, with the constellations to try to achieve all the goals that we have. Let's put China aside because that's its own creature vis-a-vis the United States. But as to everything else and everyone else, getting landing rights is critical to a lot of the businesses and could be a basis to begin a dialogue with the countries.
But let's be blunt here. A lot of this business is going to be based on defense applications. Iridium got rescued from bankruptcy by the DoD because it felt it was a system that was going to be critical to the US to preserve. And it would not be in the least surprising if a very large proportion of the revenue from some of these companies came from defense applications. And in that sense, how do you really, as a national country that's concerned about its own technological advantage in space, how do you really concede to something like a UN body that they should control your strategic priorities?
But Tim, even if let's just go with your hypothesis that the DoD defense communities in the US is driving some significant portion of revenue for the constellations, not just Iridium as it had done, but some of the others. They need the deployment in other countries as well for their missions. And they do not control the deployment in those other countries. So each of the other countries still has their own respective potential, I'm saying potential, gatekeepers to accomplish environmental or other orbital debris goals if theirs differs from that of the United States.
Well, true, but I mean, of course, the regulations applied to a host forces agreement are not necessarily the same as the regulations applied for selling terminals to consumers in the country. So completely agree that there will be limitations if, for the commercial part of the business, if you can't get access to a wide variety of countries, you're going to have a big problem generating your business plan. But that may mean that some of these operators fall back even further and harder on defense applications where the leverage points are very different for getting access into a particular country if there's a war or a disaster or some other crisis that requires access.
But I think, Tim, I mean, we can't forget the operators themselves, and certainly from an orbital debris point of view, they're probably best placed to police themselves, because if they cause debris issues in the orbits that they're in, then of course that's going to harm their own business. So in many senses, the orbital debris issue is also perhaps more easily managed thanks to the need to operate in a clean way. I think that the astronomy issue is outside of that, because there is no incentive there for the operators other than the concerns being raised by the astronomy community to behave in a different way. But the orbital debris is different.
Absolutely. I mean, Iridium didn't, got most of what it wanted against radio astronomy back 20 years ago. And really, they have made some compromises. They've made some improvements in subsequent designs. But in the end, the objectives of the radio astronomers to, keep them out of the band that was, very close to a key observing band, didn't really happen in the way that people wanted it to happen. So, it's a huge problem. And as I say, I would just take issue with Randy's statement that, she said, 20 years ago, we thought people knew what they were doing and it proved that they didn't, and now it's different. And my view is it's not different. No one knows what they're doing. No one knows what the market is. You could go, you look at what, SpaceX was saying 5 years ago, that they'd have $30 billion of annual revenue from this by 2025. No, sorry, it's not happening. I mean, it's just not. And no one actually knows what the market is. No one knows what the economics are. We're in an environment where endless money is being thrown at space. It's a huge investment theme. People are thrilled. People see these billionaires who they think must know what they're doing. And, you know, we're seeing all these SPAC companies which range from, you know, very ambitious to probably not going to work, and take your pick. So, but people are still prepared to fund them.
Yeah.
So it's a very difficult situation. How long the money lasts, how long people prepared to go on with that when they see the real results. I mean, you know, Iridium, everyone was gung-ho about this in 1998. 9 months later, it's in bankruptcy because, you know, there weren't any customers. And, you know, maybe today is different in the sense that people are more forgiving for maybe a year or two. But in the end, the proof's in the pudding, and we're going to have to see how many customers these people actually serve and how much revenue they generate and whether it's sustainable. And I will just add one point about Iridium. You know, the big difference between Iridium and Globalstar was that the satellites for Iridium lasted 20 years, which allowed them to build up a business, pay for a second generation system. Globalstar satellites lasted 7 or 8 years, and the company, you know, put the company behind the 8 ball the whole time. It's always been a massive struggle for them. And so, you know, one of the key questions in my mind for all these systems is how long their satellites last. Because if they only last 5 years, then it's all very well to say, oh, good, they'll all be upgraded. But the economics get massively, massively worse for any system if you can only make money and have to ramp up over a period of 3, 4, 5 years before you have to replace it.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, we do see that idea of go fast and break things. Randy, you had something to comment?
Yeah, I was going to say, Tim, 2 things. One is the economics of the systems are enormously different than when the Iridium and Globalstar and that whole wave of bankruptcies happened in terms of what it costs to build these satellites that are often being built just next to the engineer's desk, maybe just literally or figuratively, I don't know. And the launchers are enormously different in cost than they were back in the olden days. And so I will say to you that I do agree with you, certainly on the wave. You know, space has become sexy, and the number of companies that have been SPAC'd in pre-revenue stages is astonishing to me in terms of the successful outcome. Time will tell how many of them are still standing in 5 years or have gone through bankruptcy. And, you know, a lot of the companies we saw in bankruptcy, then the second owners were successful in building the business. So in 5 years, Tim, I predict, and we'll talk again, you and I.
This is on the record, by the way.
This is on the record. I predict that it will not be the same as the 90s. Of course, there will be plenty of companies that have consolidated or gone away because this is not sustainable in all the numbers there are in each different segment that exists. There will be but I think there will be winners that don't go through bankruptcy, and there will be, I think there will be. And so 5 years, Tim, we'll touch base.
I'll take the bet. Okay. I mean, yeah, you know, it's ironic, you know, the people who've been here a long time, and it's, you know, I found one of the most ironic comments about, you know, when Eutelsat said it was investing in OneWeb, they basically said the best thing about OneWeb is it's already had its bankruptcy. You know, and that's sort of indicative of the history here.
All right, folks, for those who are watching and attending, we do have the possibility to submit questions through Mentimeter. We can put up the code for you to quickly find. Type that in at Mentimeter. And we already have a few questions that I want to get to. Honestly, the first question is dealing with this term that we use, megaconstellations. Why must we use the term megaconstellations? They opine it is an imprecise term that hints that the more satellites that are in a constellation, the more risk the constellation poses. It clouds that fact. Any reactions to that, and maybe solutions? Professor Lewis?
Yeah, thanks, Chris. It's a good question. And my interactions with various companies, they dislike the term quite considerably. if you take the literal meaning, then of course it is not accurate. But we use mega for lots of things that are big. It's slang for things that are big, and in this case, the constellations that we're talking about are bigger than the typical space systems that we're used to. So it perhaps isn't quite as bad as you might think. But yeah, I mean, across the community I'm in, we tend to try and use the term large constellation instead.
But I mean, there's a history there. That, back in the 90s, we had little LEOs, which were the data-only small satellites like Orbcom. We had big LEOs, which was Iridium and Globalstar. And Teledesic was referred to as Mega LEO to distinguish it from Iridium and Globalstar, and to be indicative, perhaps, of broadband communication as well. So I think it's just really got picked up from there. That it, in a way, even though it shouldn't, it refers to the broadband constellations rather than anything else.
Yeah, I mean, there's the technically precise approach to finding the right term, and then there's like the effect it's going to have. And if you call them global constellations or mega constellations, it sets an image in some people's minds. I don't think we have a real solution to it, though. This next question kind of detailed what is the current thinking on the best ways for constellation operators to exchange enough information to safely coordinate their constellations. So general SSA, and how is that going to work in the future, especially between private and state-owned systems? Anyone would like to take a swing at that? That's a tough one.
I mean, let me throw in just a little bit of thinking about sort of, there's an issue of when you have, thousands of satellites, you've got to have a high level of automation. That's what SpaceX has talked about for its constellation, that everything happens by remote control. So you do run into a problem with two systems, if they're both automated, then how do they react to one another? They might both move in the same direction, so they, both don't take themselves out of the path. They both think they're diverting and they divert the same way, and they're still on a collision path. So I think there's two aspects of it. One is you have to have rules between operators in terms of saying, if you're doing this automated, then, we don't move. But the second stage to that is, if you're doing it automated, we have to trust that your system actually works. And so I think one of the rules here has to be that regulators have to impose more disclosure obligations so that people know and can verify that the other company, is doing the right thing, is going to move this way. They always move to the left or something. But you have to have validation. There has to be disclosure. It can't all be kept confidential. And you have to, have confidence that what the other side is doing makes sense, and that what you're doing is not, making the problem worse rather than better.
I agree entirely with Tim, but I also don't know that this can be fully accomplished with the mounting number of satellites out there, including failed satellites and other orbital debris, without having some kind of centralized or coordinated equivalent of an air traffic controller. Right. Someone that's either a intergovernmental body or some country that takes the lead, that continues to tell that the operators have to disclose their information to, the same way for aircraft, you have to say where you are with your aircraft, so that you can coordinate and try to avoid a collision. So I don't know that it can be done exclusively between the operators. There's just too many of them, and there's too many differences in the degree of self-supervision.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would almost categorize it into two things. One is monitoring all the stuff that's debris and can't be maneuvered, and then it's the operator, knows it's not moving and they have to, move themselves. And then there's the case of two satellites that are potentially controllable, and what do the two operators have to do? And I think the cases that were cited in the introductory talk about ESA and Starlink and OneWeb, were all satellites that were under control, and the issue there was the simple fact of who's going to move? Is it you or me? and not necessarily knowing what Starlink was doing. When it was said to all be automated, well, who knows how that automation works? Which way does it move? Do you trust it? All of these sorts of aspects. So I think, I completely agree with Randy that for the debris side, the stuff that isn't moving, there needs to be, considerable monitoring, lots of good information about that, responsibility put onto the operators, but then, monitoring what the operators are doing, understanding, the regulators have a responsibility to understand that their procedures are best practice and that what they're, how they're reacting relative to one another.
Oh no, it looks like he froze for a second. But I think that really leads into this next question about what happens if a constellation operator goes bankrupt. So please display that next question. What happens when a constellation operator goes bankrupt with a partially deployed constellation? Is there contingency plans? And they say that it seems unlikely a buyer would emerge. So, Randy, how would a national regulator, even consider that? Are they thinking about something like that? And what do you think would happen?
Well, first, I think that spectrum, most of these systems have spectrum or have ITU priority of some sort, which are both valuable commodities. And so I believe that even if it's a giveaway of a system that someone would assume in bankruptcy, and most bankruptcy laws of most countries are pretty much the same, would assume the liability and to deorbit or to do whatever else it is for the constellations and or use the constellations for another purpose, particularly if they have spectrum and the like. So, a partially deployed system can still be used for certain purposes, and or a buyer could pivot and come up with a new business model for the spectrum, for the system. There was speculation at some point with OneWeb that even if they didn't continue with that constellation, the spectrum alone was very valuable to someone.
It's also worth pointing out that during the bankruptcy, the satellites paused in the orbit raising, for example. They didn't continue in the way that they could have done, because of course, if no buyer emerged, then the safest thing to do for the environment would have been to deorbit those satellites, and it's easier to do that from the less risky from the lower altitude. So I think the liability issue is a really good one, because obviously the responsibility is going to fall to the launching states, to take the necessary action at the cost, of course. So it was good to see that actually there was that pause with OneWeb in terms of their operations.
I have a directed question, although it is, many people could weigh in, and it's this one about prospects for reforming the regulatory system. Someone asks, Randy, what are the prospects of reforming the regulatory regime to include things like light pollution? When you apply for a frequency, when you apply for a launch license, it doesn't ask on there, are you affecting ground-based astronomy? Or, it just isn't on there. Should it be? And if you were a regulator, how would you take some of these equities into consideration?
Well, the regulatory regime has been undergoing in the last 5 years significant evolution to try to actually be quicker on its feet, because some of the regulators and the ITU process and the FCC was a very slow one and wasn't addressed to a lot of the commercialization of space. And there was a real move in the last 5 years to try to accelerate and expedite regulatory approvals and to make it easier to go to space. I think that there are, though, a number of issues as the technology continues to evolve with large constellations, issues that no one thought of really, the light pollution when they were building it, etc. I think the FCC in particular has pushed back recently and said satellites are not governed by Environmental Protection Act. There's an ongoing case in DC that's by competitors, competitive satellite companies challenging the Starlink constellation. And I think that, so I think that the regulators are going to need also to kind of come together on some of these issues, because these LEO constellations and large constellations, especially the ones that don't need landing rights in other countries, the other countries don't have a say on what those constellations are going to look like and how it affects their territory. So it's not just, I don't think it should just be the regulator of the existing country that has a say, but then that wreaks havoc. If you start imposing all these other requirements like light pollution, NEPA, everything else, then the speed that we've gained over the last 5 years to support commercialization and the space industry will become halted. And so it's a real trade-off. It's a real trade-off of how do we take into consideration these issues, and at the same time, how do we support the commercialization of space?
That's the dilemma. That's the paradox. Anyone else want to weigh in? Should the regulators ask that question? Should it be on their application? Andy?
Yeah. So I mean, at some point in the distant past, the FCC didn't consider space debris guidelines, and then at some point they did. And of course, part of the logic behind its inclusion was that orbital debris affects the asset that is under regulating kind of directly. But I mean, it's it would be trivial for a regulator to add in this extra kind of step that they have to do. But I think, as Randy said, it comes with a cost which is then imposed on that particular system. And I think that this is where, really, as Randy said, we need the regulators to come together. And I mean, I think it would be possible and sort of agree that, from a certain time, all the major spacefaring countries agree to include, a certain set of minimum standards against light pollution. And, I will also point out that there is actually a law that regulates, well, there's one single law that regulates light pollution from space, and this is the US law against space advertising, which, sort of came in via, I think it was direct from the Congress, so it didn't sort of go through the regulatory process. So, I mean, it is possible.
Tim, if we add these requirements, these questions on already to the mega constellation prospects for mega constellations, how does that change your prognosis and your predictions for the future? Would it actually slow down the growth of mega constellations?
Well, I think one of the issues that has to be considered is the degree to which it makes people flee to regulatory jurisdictions which don't have these rules. I mean, it's already been a big issue in launch about, to what degree do you have to post bonds? To what degree do you have to have insurance against casualties if something falls out of space and lands on someone's head? All of these sorts of things is like, well, for any satellite operator has to then take the decision of like, well, do I go to this country where it has these, impositions? Maybe, if that country is going to be really supportive of me and help to lobby to get my stuff, in the right place, regulatory wise, in terms of market access, then maybe that's a trade-off worth making. On the other hand, you're going to have more fly-by-night operators going to countries which don't impose these rules, and that doesn't help anyone.
All right. Thank you for that. Listen, last question. I have to ask it because it was upvoted so much, and we have to face, this conception, this idea. How do you avoid the concern that mega constellations are essentially appropriating certain orbits, that the sole occupant of a particular orbit? That's a concern. Anyone want to weigh in?
Well, I would say it's not just orbits. I mean, clearly that when there's a lot at a particular altitude, it gets very difficult for anyone else to launch there. I worry at least as much about appropriating spectrum, and we have this dilemma between the US rules and the ITU rules, with who has priority, who has to share. Elon Musk said he doesn't respect the ITU like he doesn't respect the Securities and Exchange Commission. When people say that sort of thing, how do you resolve it? I don't know.
All right. Listen, last thoughts as we wrap it up. the idea that we have all these competing uses. I think we presented kind of a whole buffet of issues and questions. Maybe we didn't get to any particular answers though, but any last thoughts, please go ahead.
So I think from my side, if I was in the position of an operator, I'd actually be quite frustrated. They've demonstrated perhaps high reliability of the systems. They've innovated towards smaller satellites that are more capable. They've addressed all of the IADC concerns on an individual satellite basis. Yeah, I'd be quite frustrated at the moment. You know, that they've really pushed forwards really quite effectively, and yet they're seeing all these concerns being raised still. That the goalposts are shifting all the time. But I think that's an ongoing process that they're going to have to deal with.
Fair enough. Thank you for that. I want to thank all my panelists for offering their wisdom and their expertise in this last hour. And we're now going to move directly into the next session, the next panel on activating active debris removal. So thank you to everyone. And we go directly into our spotlight talk from Darren McKnight.
Hello, my name is Darren McKnight, Senior Technical Fellow for LEO Labs, and I have the pleasure of starting off the session on activating active debris removal. The vast majority of the debris generating potential in low Earth orbit, or LEO, resides in a few hundred massive derelict objects, often abandoned in tight altitude clusters that amplify the probability of significant debris generating event. As early as 2000, all of the major spacefaring agencies identified this pool of several hundred objects. This list provided a clear story, but it did not provide actionable priorities. Recent analysis by a team of 19 global experts from 13 countries reduced this longer list into the top 50 prioritized list. The top 20 objects were 20 SL-16 rocket bodies, 18 of which are centered at 840 kilometers altitude. As a side note, the top 50 objects were roughly 80% abandoned before 2000, roughly 80% rocket bodies, and roughly 80% of Russian Soviet origin. Further, this year, a new analytic tool was created, the LEO Collision Risk Continuum, which examined over 400,000 conjunction data messages, or CDMs, issued by LEO Labs during the last half of 2020. These CDMs included all objects against all objects. The search was not limited to the riskiest conjunctions for the largest objects only. We let the data select the worst offenders. The probability of each conjunction was multiplied by the total mass of the objects included. This served as a surrogate for consequences if a collision happened to occur. This total mass involved in each close approach was used to obtain a risk value. For this analysis of all objects in the space catalog, the top 4 items were again SL-16 rocket bodies. Further, the analysis clearly showed what had been hypothesized in the past from previous analyses. The greatest risk to future debris growth is from potential collisions between massive derelicts abandoned decades ago, not the small, agile, newly deployed smallsats populating constellations. Further, there are 2 altitude regimes that continue to rise up in all analyses as potential hotspots for future debris growth, and therefore targets for ADR. These 2 regions are centered around 840 kilometers and 975 kilometers. While active debris removal, or ADR, as a remediation option is rapid and permanent, there is some benefit to consider the general category of remediate in orbit to work cooperatively with ADR. This may be even more relevant for the most massive objects such as the SL-16s, as their removal would definitely require controlled reentry to assure limiting the probability of ground casualty to below the threshold of 1 in 10,000. Just-in-time collision avoidance, or JCA, and nanotugs are examples of remediate in orbit options. JCA calls for the use of either laser impulse or interaction with a ballistically launched cloud to nudge one of the 2 derelict objects from an imminent collision. If a JCA solution could be developed that was much less expensive and responsive than ADR, and conjunction dynamics accuracy improved, this solution might become a valuable complement to ADR for the most massive of derelict objects. Similarly, a nanotug is simply a small, probably a 6U CubeSat system that could be attached to an abandoned derelict object. The nanotug comprises accelerometers, electric thrusters, GPS receiver to, in essence, bring the derelict object back to life by providing the capability to perform collision avoidance maneuvers as necessary. We are decades beyond the point of urgency of cleaning up mass deposit in LEO decades ago, whose collisional churning may adversely affect commercial and national security space system for decades to come. This is especially true for constellations of satellite whose collective exposed area will make them uniquely susceptible to lethal non-trackable debris. So, as the popular press and regulators seem to be fixated on constellations as a catalyst for reduced space safety, I propose that the constellations will end up being the victims of decades of complacency in debris remediation and debris mitigation policy and regulation. Thank you for your time.
We recognize the growing hazard of space debris and increasing congestion in Earth's orbit. We welcome all efforts, public and commercial, in debris removal and on-orbit servicing activities, and undertake to encourage further institutional or industrial research and development of these services. My name is Ian Christensen, Director of Private Sector Programs for Secure World Foundation. Those were not my words, but rather are quotes from a joint statement issued by the leaders of the G7 countries after their summit in England earlier this month. The spotlight talk we just heard from Darren McKnight gives us an idea of part of the reasons why the G7 countries might have made this statement. The urgency of the need to address the orbital debris challenge is indeed increasing. Following through on policy statements will require sustained attention to implementation. Technical research and development will surely be needed, but it will also require understanding whether there is economic and business rationale or reason to tackle space debris. In the next 55 minutes, this panel on activating active debris removal plans to dive into these topics. What can we do to spur government and industry alike to get serious about removing orbital debris? We have a panel of experts well placed to look at this from multiple angles: economics, business, and policy. You can find their full bios on the Summit website, but I do want to briefly introduce each of them. Asha Balakrishnan is a research staff member at the Science and Technology Policy Institute, a federally funded research and development center that provides analysis of science and technology policy issues for the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. Recently, she has collaborated with colleagues on a number of reports on space situational awareness, orbital debris issues, space traffic management, and small satellite technologies. Asha holds a PhD degree in mechanical engineering from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Clelia Iacomino is a research fellow at the C-Lab, the Space Economy Evolution Lab of STA Bocconi School of Management in Milan. She is currently a PhD candidate in management and innovation at the Catholic University of Milan. Her research interests include technological trends regarding on-orbit servicing, economic theory applied to space debris, and the role of industry and public sustainability. Luke Yeh is the CEO and co-founder of ClearSpace, a Switzerland-based startup for space debris in orbit servicing for sustainable space operations. Luke studied at the EPFL Space Center with a master's degree in electrical engineering. Charity Wheaton is vice president for Global Space Communications. She scales global policy efforts spaceflight safety and ensuring space system. Charity also serves as the chair of the U.S. Commercial Space Transportation Advisory Committee, COMPAC. She holds a master's degree in space operations from the University of North Dakota. I'm excited to get to the discussion and I welcome our panelists on this virtual stage. But first, a brief word on the matters. We'll leave plenty of time in this panel for audience questions. Please submit your questions via the Mentimeter website. And our first question today is going to go to Chloe. So Chloe, we started this conference this morning with a discussion of space's role in addressing climate change. C-Lab has looked at the parallels between the challenges of debris, challenges of climate change. Darren's introductory talk, how would you describe the environmental challenge that space debris represents?
So thank you, Ian. Thank you to inviting me to in this interesting event. So as C-Lab, we started to study the space debris problems, and we started, when we started to analyze this problem, we compare the space debris problem ecosystem with the climate change. And we started to analyze in particular what was happening in the climate change, so the comparison with the biosphere degradation, tropical forest loss, so the cumulative problems and the cumulative effects regarding the natural ecosystem with the parallel with the orbit ecosystem. So let me read a quote that was very important for us when we started to compare the orbital, the debris problems with the climate change. So the quote is of the professor Alfred Kane, that was an American professor and expert in regulation. So he developed a theory, the theory of the small decision. He said that the tyranny of the small decision is a situation in which a series of small individual rational decisions cumulatively result in a larger and significant outcome, which is neither optimal nor desired and can negatively change the context of choices, even to the point where desired alternatives are irreversibly destroyed. So it was what is happening with the space debris and the challenges and the comparison that we did with the natural ecosystem and the orbit ecosystem.
Thank you, Clelia. I understand there's some problems with my connection, so hopefully folks can hear me. If not, okay, sounds like it's better. So we'll try this, and if my internet goes bad again, we'll have to see if we can have a colleague step in. My apologies here. So Charity, Luke, the next question is going to be basically the same question for both of you. So maybe if I can have Charity go first, and then Luke once Charity finishes. And the question is, what is your company doing to respond to the challenges that Darren and Clelia have just talked about? What near-term mission milestones can we look for from your company? So Charity first, and then to Luke. Thank you.
Great. Can you hear me, Ian? Can you hear me?
I can hear you, yes.
Okay, great. Just wanted to check. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Appreciate the invitation. So space sustainability is a growing market and an essential element of a robust space economy. Astroscale is on the leading edge of an emerging on-orbit services market. We're developing technologies, the business models, and driving the policy discussions globally. We support the management of the space environment via life extension, in situ space situation awareness, end of life, which is disposal of prepared objects, and active debris removal, which is disposal of unprepared objects. Key to these missions, what many on-orbit services have in common, are rendezvous and proximity operations, docking and capture, automation, and ground support command and control. And this is why our first in-orbit demo for end-of-life services will naturally advance efforts across all these business lines. Our very own LCD, End-of-Life Services by Astroscale demo, is the first commercial mission to demonstrate end-to-end debris docking and removal. And it launched in March of this year, and we'll be testing a series of progressively difficult maneuvers to capture a prepared satellite, one equipped with a lightweight docking plate that was stacked with our servicer. LCD has since passed its major operational checkups, and we will begin the demonstrations later on this summer. You can track LCD on our website, and we are sharing ephemeris, covariance, and maneuver plans with both ESA and the 18th. Notably, this demonstration is entirely self-funded. LCD is exciting because it's that first demonstration of an end-to-end debris docking and removal. We see all debris as a threat to space commerce, exploration, national security, critical services, and our way of life. And while small debris is clearly problematic, it's also important to prevent large debris from becoming smaller pieces of debris by remediating those objects that pose the greatest threat. Last year, Astroscale was selected as commercial partner for JAXA's commercial removal debris demonstration, Phase 1, which is the inspection of an upper stage rocket body expected to launch by 2023. Finally, let's not forget space sustainability also involves economic sustainability in orbit. Last year, Astroscale announced its entry into the satellite life extension market, which adds value and ensures effective use of the limited natural resource that is GEO. So I'll just pause there and hand it over to Luc.
Thank you. Thank you for having me on this panel. So ClearSpace is a spin-off from the EPFL in Lausanne. Initially, it's a team of engineers, EPFL, that's been working since 2010 to find a solution to actually remove space debris from orbit. And the project has initiated after launching a CubeSat straight into the field of debris of the Cosmos Iridium collision, which generated obviously a lot of conjunction notifications and really brought our team to start thinking through, okay, what can be done and what should be done to address the growing problem of space debris. ClearSpace has been spun off in 2018, and we signed a contract with the European Space Agency to lead the first debris removal mission, where we have as objective to go pick up a piece of debris that belongs to the European Space Agency in orbit and remove it by end of 2025. This mission called ClearSpace One is the first mission to execute the complete value chain of removing a piece of debris from orbit, addressing all the different dimensions, whether legal challenges, liability challenges, but also technical challenges on how to actually pick up a non-cooperative object in orbit. Today, ClearSpace is about 40 employees. We work with an extensive industrial team across Europe, and we're in the first phases of the development of our mission.
All right. Thank you, Charity. Thank you, Luc. And I think we'll have time to come back to some of these activities in the subsequent discussions. I'm already seeing some questions in the chat that have to do with the specifics of Astroscale and ClearSpace missions. So we'll get to those towards the end of the panel as well today here. But I want to turn now to Asha. So I referenced the G7 statement at the beginning of this panel, and we've also seen in the U.S. National Space Policy a goal to evaluate and pursue active debris removal. And in January of this year, we saw the NASA Inspector General issue a report, Office of the Inspector General issue a report that argues that mitigation alone is not sufficient, and that we need more strategic remediations, strategic remediation activities to address space debris. Can you tell us about the current state of U.S. government activities regarding active debris removal?
Sure. Thank you for inviting me on to talk about this topic. So in addition, in January, not just the OIG from NASA issued a report, but the OSTP, the Office of Science Technology Policy, the White House also issued a National Orbital Debris Research and Development Plan, which laid out some of the research priorities for all areas with respect to debris. So there are kind of three major thrusts in that. One was debris mitigation. One was tracking and characterization of debris, which is very related to SSA and STM. And the third one, really for the first time in sort of a national level document like this, they addressed remediation of debris as a core element or a core area. And they then further sort of described three particular research and development efforts that agencies should move forward with. And these were develop remediation, repurposing technologies and techniques for large debris objects, as well as the same type of thing, but not repurposing technologies, but remediation technologies and techniques for small debris objects. So similar to kind of what Darren was talking about, there are many ways to go about this. In that paper of 50 derelict objects, they're very large ones that one could try and remove for the purposes of removing risk long term. But then there's also a lot of discussion with respect to lethal non-trackable debris that's, could be mission ending. And so they identified two areas. And then the third one, which I think is a really important area, and it's one that I think a lot of the people on this panel have talked about, is developing models for risk and cost benefit analysis. And I think that everybody sort of feels like there are models out there. They may touch on some aspects of risk or some aspects of pertinent to certain type of debris, but we really haven't seen sort of a holistic model looking at all of the trade-offs between the impacts of the probabilities, as well as the different orbits and the regimes, and the sort of the numbers of satellites that are going up in that area, and not just technical risk, but also economic risk as well. I would say that the last thing is, we do need better data. So that tracking and characterization piece that is part of the R&D plan is a really important piece, because the models are only as good as the data that we have. And I fear that for the large debris, we have, better data, and there's more work going on with some of the in situ SSA and some improvements in space fence and coming online and those kinds of things. But I think on the small debris scale, we don't have as much good data that has really good accuracy to it to really understand the environment enough. So I would say lastly, on the ADR technology and where the US government is, I think they're still this is a long-term thing, and that there is no one agency that has the mission nor the funding to do this. And so that's where we're stuck. We're stuck with that when it comes to space traffic management. We're stuck with that when it comes to ADR as well. So I feel like there needs to be a little bit of a unsticking in the government realm.
Yeah, indeed, the who and what one agency in that question is one that is coming up in several different areas of U.S. space policy right now, and seems to be good.
One is not immune to it either.
Yeah. So I think maybe that might again be another one that we come back to here as we go, because I think that relates. It certainly relates to the previous panel with the space traffic management question, and it relates to this as well. So, speaking of the previous panel, we just had a good discussion of some of the challenges that the policy and regulatory structure for these large constellations pose, and the topic of debris certainly came up in that discussion as well. Darren in his talk suggested that these large constellation operators might actually potentially be a victim of some of this regulatory tension, in that the existing risk from the large objects is where some of the real challenge is, and these constellations are operating in that environment, right? So I want to pose a question to you, Charity. Your company has worked with one of these large constellation operators in some technology development programs along with the European Space Agency. What is the role of the large constellation community in addressing the debris challenge on orbit?
Well, yeah, just great to point out that Astroscale did announce a partnership with OneWeb in May to develop an ELSA that can conduct multiple end-of-life disposals. And, per your comment on Darren, he always does make good points. Derelict debris, approximately 8,000 tons of it, is a real threat to operators in orbit. However, as we increase the use of orbit, we need to prevent additions to this derelict population, right? So any additions pose a threat to creating those lethal non-trackable that Asha was talking about, but also interrupt critical services and commerce by requiring more collision avoidance maneuvers. So even if they deorbit within the international norm of 25 years, they're still creating a perturbation, if you will, on the normal operations in orbit. Large constellations are exciting, and they bring a wealth of benefits to us here on Earth. And I personally know people in communities who are benefiting from the proliferation of access to space, but we can't add to the population of debris in space now. And we need to be responsive to new hazards and congestions. So this means one of two things for constellation providers, and really all operators in space. Either ensure high reliability of satellites, which might be rather expensive, or have a plan for a controlled disposal at end of mission. Regulators under Article 6 of the Outer Space Treaty need to make sure one of these two options happen. And there's no middle ground here in terms of space safety. So what does this mean, and how do we get from here? That's the major question at hand. I feel the first step is to measure accurately what that risk of a system is, meaning the entire system's risk needs to be measured for probability of collision. Next, we need to cap that risk. No one wants excessive or unlimited risk in this business. It would simply drive investors away. And third, proper monitoring is needed of this risk profile that constellations are imposing on the space environment. Right now, there are educated guesses at best, of how a constellation may impact the environment. How about a near real-time update as the system is deployed? And finally, there is no use making limits if regulators aren't going to enforce said limits. So sure, customer access to the benefit of a constellation should be natural economic driver to limit debris. But what if it's not? Well, then governments are ultimately liable for private operator activity. So there should be financial carrots and sticks, as Asha mentioned, the economic drivers here, that drive responsible behaviors in space and limit debris. So just foot stomping, we're all in this together. Operational satellites that can maneuver around debris are good things. Transparency and information sharing among operators to understand who's doing what is a good thing. Space situational awareness is a good thing. Space traffic coordination and management is a good thing. But inactive satellites without collision avoidance, raining down through operational orbits and human spaceflight is not a good thing. And I don't care if that takes 2, 5, or 25 years to deorbit. I count current large debris objects among the items that are not conducive to a successful space environment or space economy.
Thank you, Charity. And I'm seeing a lot of questions coming in the audience here, so this is good. I've got a couple more I want to ask that we discussed in advance, but we're going to get to those audience questions, so keep them coming. So Claudia, this next one I'm going to turn to you. So both Asha and Charity now have mentioned the need to create economic incentives and possibly the consequences and enforcement penalties that might come along with that. From your standpoint, does the rise of large constellations, does that pose or offer any sort of solution or relationship to the economic challenge of addressing space debris? Does it kind of change the way that we think about the economics of the space debris challenge?
So this was the point that helped us as a research center when we started our research. So, and in particular, the question that guided us was, is the market that can solve the problem of the space debris, or we need the government intervention in order to solve this kind of problem? So I did before the parallel with the climate change that was a useful example to understand the role of the public and also the private sector. For sure, this question, so is the market that can solve this problem? So we try to answer to this question through a simulation of different scenarios. So we try to understand, first of all, the risk. So if the risk of collision is in the medium term, in the short term, in the medium term, on the long term. So this for sure change the position of the private sector in order to invest in such technologies. And we started, first of all, to understand which kind of technologies the private sector can use and have the economic incentive to use in order to avoid and to solve the problem of the space debris. And we analyze the mitigation of, for example, post-mission disposal or collision avoidance technologies, active debris removal technology. So we saw that this technology, in effect, mitigate the risk of collision. And in particular, the post-mission disposal solution was, in our point of view, first of all, a good solution to mitigate the collision, because we saw the curve of the risk lower than the curve of the risk of collision. So this was in our conclusion a cheap solution for the private sector in order to have economic incentive to invest and to use the post-mission disposal. For sure, if the risk is in the short term, if the risk in other scenarios, so that was in the long term, I don't think that the private sector would use this kind of solution. So to use their fuel in order to deorbit the satellites and so on. I think that in the long term scenario we saw, and I think that the private sector decide to leave their satellites to fail to the orbit. And I think that in this case, the active debris removal is needed for the dead satellite in this case. But also for the active debris removal is a question that I ask to myself, but also when I talk with my colleagues, is that is there the market for the active debris removal?
So you're hitting on, I think, a number of themes there, right? One that we talked a lot already in this panel about the need to have a good understanding, characterization of the technical and economic risk and being able to communicate that across actors. You're also talking about, active debris removal as part of an overall scope of responses that operators need to take here, including, simply post-mission disposal compliance is important, and operators need to put that into the business plan. So, Luke, turning to you now. So Clelia talked about, whether if there is or is not a private market for active debris removal. Your company is trying to find that market, right? That is what both you and then part of Astroscale's business as well, right? So outside of technology, what factors do we need to have further development in to enable the commercial debris removal market?
Well, I think to reflect on what has been said until now, I agree with Darren. Right, that large objects are a major issue and have to be addressed. And I agree with Charity that we have to build up a solution that is sustainable for the future. I think the first thing is that we have to overall, generally, whether if it's agencies or commercial operation, recognize the complete cost of space operation. And the complete cost of space operation means the complete cost of a sustainable space operation. And in this cost, removal of debris has to be included. You cannot consider that you looked at the complete mission, say, okay, now it flies, we paid for it, we operated this platform or this satellite for a while, everything's okay, whether it fails or not in orbit. And often what has been done in the past is that when you look at the overall cost of a space mission, you would go all the way up to the point where the satellite fails in orbit or is deorbited, if it has been deorbited. And I think that this is not the complete cost. The complete cost should include also the deorbiting. And specifically, I mean, if you follow the logic of Darren, specifically for the most dangerous or problematic objects in orbit to start with. And this means that the first thing that has to happen is that agencies have to start looking at the object they have in orbit and say, okay, what kind of budget can we put in place to make sure that we don't produce a situation which will affect everyone in the future? But then beyond that, I think this has to be also integrated in the business case for commercial operators. And the question then is, what is the dynamics, the financial dynamics that makes that the payment of that kind of service is just a natural a step of a complete business case. So I think this dimension is really important. Regulation, we have a lot of regulation today that are in place already. There's a lot of things that are just not applied. I think, and the other part that is happening right now that we can see happening much faster than we actually expected when we created Clear Space is the conscience of the problem, right? I remember for years before we created Clear Space, people would tell us, nobody will ever pay for that. Nobody will ever pay for the orbiting mission. Why would anybody pay for that? Doesn't make any sense, right? You're just removing a piece of debris to make space for the others. I mean, it's the tragedy of the commons. There's no reason why somebody should ever pay for that. And when we created Clear Space, when we founded the company at the beginning, we thought it's gonna be hard to find investors, so we should find sponsors, right, to actually make a demonstration. And we were surprised to see how quickly everything evolved. And we see that the timing is right to affect change today. So what has to be done is first, I think that agencies start thinking about the object they have in orbit. I think what's interesting actually in the list of the 50 most dangerous objects in orbit is that there's not a single American one in the list. Well, there's just one. I think there should be more transparency about what's up there. There should be conscience in the agency. Start and think, okay, how do we put in place a budget that makes sure that we increase the space of operational orbits? There's some orbits where Constellation already cannot operate today. There's some orbits where you can already see Kessler syndromes appearing, right? So you see that happening already today. It's a very slow evolving problem, but it's already there. So the first step for me is those lists. I agree with Darren that those lists of 50 objects have to be addressed, and I agree with Charity. We have to build up the constellations in a way that takes in account all the different outcomes of an end of mission, and actually just addresses them in a consistent and logical way.
Thank you, Luke, and you've teed up the question that I want to start with from the audience. We almost like we planned this, but it just worked out this way. So you were talking at the end of that remark about how to communicate the value and the need to start working on these top 50 objects and to start working on integrating this into the business case of the large constellations and designing those to operate safely and sustainably. The question, so the question I'm going to put up on the screen here shortly here, and I'm going to ask Asha to start and then the other panelists to come in. So Asha, as we try to communicate the need to address debris, to remove the large objects, to figure out how to field active debris removal services, how should we as a community be communicating that to lawmakers and to policymakers? Is there anything you've seen in your experience where messaging has worked well or perhaps has not? And then I'll let the other panelists come in as they think there.
So I haven't seen much in my experience in terms of like moving this forward to get sort of the SSA and STM, we're still waiting on that. I think that with respect to ADR though, one thing that I think might work if not we, I'm not an advocate here, but if one was to pull a story together about the cost now versus the cost later. I think you have to think about, it might seem expensive now with lots of dollar signs or euros, but if you waited and it created a more kind of much more untenable situation down the line, then the cost to remove millions of pieces of debris if things ended up colliding or, so that comes back to the data and that comes back to the models. So we need to be able to have really robust models with good data, right? Not data that we took in shuttle windows in 2011 or 2009 for predicting what the debris environment is. We need really, good data on the small debris side as well as the large one to feed into these models so we can convince ourselves of understanding, what does it look like down the line? And if we did this now, yes, it's going to cost money, but it's going to cost a lot less than if we did it later.
Thank you for that. Charity?
Asha reminds me of a great quote from Darren. Pay me now or pay me more later is essentially what he says. There's a good paper at IAC on that. Recommend everyone read that. And just to quickly add on, this really comes down to domestic priorities, right? Those policy priorities. Clearly, Europe and Japan have made it a priority to invest in research and development for debris removal. And therefore, there are programs. And I feel that ADR and just generically on-orbit services writ large check a lot of domestic priority boxes for the United States in particular, of international collaboration, technology development, growing the industry, national security, application to exploration, and just simple leadership, being involved and making sure that the United States is involved in ensuring, the norms and leading the rules and the norms and behavior on this sort of activity as well. So the stars are aligned. It just needs action like other domestic priorities do.
I mean, I think we could certainly interpret the G7 statement as, a recognition of wanting to take that leadership that you're talking about there, Charity. But, it's a good statement. Let's work on the follow through and providing that story and implementation that needs to be provided. All right, so we are fully into the audience Q&A portion here. So we're going to jump around to some different subjects here as we go, but I'm sure some same commonality and threads will come up. So the next one it kind of goes towards spurring action and some of the tools that we might or might not use. And so, Kalia, I'm going to put you on the spot to answer this first, and then other panelists might come in because there's a little bit of economic theory behind this. Would a prize model or a bounty model provide an effective incentive to remove some of these hazardous objects that we're talking about?
Yes, it was mentioned before. So I think that if we demonstrate that the risk is now, so is not in the long term, but is in the short term, I think that is an important point to change the government attitude to fund the technologies or to fund the private sector in order to take the action to mitigate the debris, the space debris. So this is the point that I want to stress about to understand, to demonstrate the risk, because it's the one point that can convince the governments to take an action. And it was happening with the environment on Earth. So before you mentioned that if we pay now, invest now, in the future we will have less cost about to invest to technologies, and it's true. So if we invest now to the technologies to help the private sector in order to avoid and to mitigate the risk, also there are several options that the government can do, is to fund the technologies, or through the public-private partnership is a good solution in order to invest in technologies such as active debris removal, because we know that the active debris removal is a costly solution if we compare these technologies with other technologies. So this was the logic that we did when we started our research. So to understand, to compare the cost of the different solutions, and we know that the active debris removal is a costly technologies, and there is the need of the government to co-fund this kind of solution, and the public-private partners could be so an option in order to help the private sector.
Yeah, so that's an interesting suggestion, that the use of the PPP model, which we've seen for other areas of kind of government and commercial cooperation on space system development with success, might be something that we look at here. And I think there are elements of public-private partnership in both the Clear Space mission and some of the Astroscale partnerships as well. So I think that is something that the governments are looking at. All right, so the next round of questions is going to be a lightning round for our Astroscale and ClearSpace colleagues. We have a lot of questions in the chat about where you guys are going, what your missions look like, and how you interact with each other. So Asha and Clelia, I mean, you can chime in if you have anything on there, but it might be a brief break for you. So putting a question up, but the first question, just to kind of get started here, ClearSpace and Astroscale, are you guys competitors, and are there others in your market space if you are? So Luke and Charity, I don't know who wants to take that one on, but go for it.
I think to be competitor, there should be the market already, probably. It is we have regular interactions, and we obviously see each other, because we are trying to produce the same change in the industry, maybe with a different approach in different regions. But at the end, what we see is that the market, when it activates to actually address all that, requires more than both of our companies to actually address the complete problem. So there's plenty of room to do a lot of work. Right now, what we can see is that we are active. Well, in Europe, we're active together. Astroscale is active in the UK. But otherwise, I mean, we are on a European mission. Astroscale is on a Japanese mission. The question is, how far can international collaboration work? And that's one of the questions that will at some point come up. Mostly also because for many, ADR technologies are considered as dual use, right? And there can be limitations and strategic interests from different countries around that. But yeah, I think at the end we might likely end up competing on some market and collaborating some others.
I'll just echo some of what Luke said. Maybe less competitors and more pioneers, aren't we, Luke, in this space? And really, this industry needs to be collaborative at this very moment. We need to get together to build those policy and best practices to conduct these operations safely. a small difference between our companies. I feel Astroscale is looking at a whole suite of on-orbit services in a number of orbits. ADR is just one of those missions, right? If you can rendezvous with another object in orbit, you can provide in situ SSA, life extension, maintenance, et cetera, et cetera. And just a shout out to those industry associations and industry groups that are driving best practices and making sure this is a sustainable and safe market is the Consortium for the Execution of Rendezvous and Servicing. Of course, there's other ad hoc groups like the Space Safety Coalition. And I know that, probably Luke's company and Astroscale, we're part of many, many discussions with our industry colleagues. So it needs to be collaborative.
Thank you. And so we had a question there that I think you both have already spoken to about whether you're doing the same thing or definitive differences. It's a little bit of both, right? I like Charity. I like the phrasing, pioneers, not competitors, right? Because as Luke said, make the market and then compete for the market. Luke, you've already teed up the next question very nicely. You keep doing that for me, so thank you. There's a question from the audience. So Luke, you mentioned there's some potential dual use implications of some of this technology, right? For ADR or for servicing. So the question is, are your companies doing anything to make sure that ADR operations don't create security concerns? And so what is the relationship between civil ADR technology that we're talking about in this panel and some of the national security implications that might have?
So, I think to do a mission that has a national security implication, you have to be placed on the right orbit. You have to get an authorization to launch. This means that you would have either to have an authorization by launching state that actually knows what you're planning to do, because you have to provide a lot of content, a lot of detail about what you're going to do in orbit, especially if you do in-orbit servicing. This is already quite a deterrent. The other aspect is that we look at it, for us, it's quite obvious that the solution we're building is a sustainability solution. That's what we're after. That's what we try to build. And I'm certain the Astroscale as well. We want to address a fundamental problem. And in our perspective, there's a lot of dimension that can make, if you want to dehabilitate or break a satellite or a military satellite, you don't necessarily need to actually capture it. You need to collide with it. You need to do other stuff. And there's probably ways that are much more cost effective to actually do that than actually do the complete exercises we do it. In addition to that, I think that it's a little like an ambulance. You don't use an ambulance for warfare, mostly because you know that if you start to do that, the cost benefit in terms of your complete exercise makes it illogical, right? You have more to lose than to win if you start using it this way. So that's the way we look at it. Maybe it's a little naive when it comes to military application, but for us, it's clearly the approach is very clearly, and it has to remain a sustainability solution that we are building here. Nevertheless, it's a solution that is dual use and will be classified as dual use. What we export and how we addressed it, because the question obviously came in from the Swiss government when we started working on the first mission for ESA, the question came up, and it comes up on a regular basis. What we export is a service and not the spacecraft or the technology itself.
I'll just add that Astroscale categorically is against the deliberate creation of debris in orbit. Okay? That is incredibly important, and that is our ethos and the reason why we stood up as a company. Beyond that, the government, sort of point fingers here, can be the worst offender of debris generation in orbit, especially the last 6 decades. So we feel that government should be customers of our services, right, to prevent debris incidents from occurring. Just echoing Luke, private operators are regulated by domestic nations, and therefore we have to adhere to space safety standards. We also are pushing norms of behavior, best practices in this market as well. And as I said, we're regulated and want to develop solutions, not create problems. So that's all I say about that.
Thank you. And I think, an important point that I think both of you are talking about, right, is, we discussed earlier transparency and sharing of information, right? And there's going to be, a civil commercial mission. There's going to be an emphasis on transparency and information sharing. At least we hope that helps to distinguish those sorts of activities from something that might be more national security in nature. So thank you, Charity and Luke, for the clear space and astroscale portion of this questioning. I'm going to try and open up to a broader question now. The number of questions in the chat about removing spent rocket bodies, right? And we know the majority of those bodies are Russian and there's some Chinese ones as well, right, from the top 50 list. There's a legal and policy question here around permissions to remove those objects, responsibility to remove those objects, and liability associated with that, right? So a broad question about what legal and policy tools can we think about to address nations that do not consent to the removal of their derelict objects, or to encourage those nations to start participating in removal of those objects. So open to anyone on the panel who wants to try to take that thorny issue on. Did that not come through?
No, we can hear you. It's a little better now, though. I'm not going to be able to answer that question. I think that's a really, really hard question. I think we're all sort of silent because we don't know. This is really an international cooperation diplomacy issue. I mean, this cannot be solved by technology development. One of the things that when we helped support sort of the orbital debris R&D plan, we looked at, okay, what are the big challenges in orbital debris? Irrespective of R&D, what are the major challenges? And then what can R&D solve? And R&D can solve some of the challenges, but they cannot solve the liability challenge. They cannot solve, post-mission disposal, people complying with the 25-year rule. They cannot solve the registration challenge. And so these are things that have to happen on the diplomatic efforts. And, I'm now going to step back and feign that, although I'm a policy analyst, I'm an engineer and I'm not a diplomat. So
I'll add, Ian, that when we say we look to leadership of this sort of issue, this is what we're talking about. We'd like to see nations get together and discuss what is that pathway forward before technology catches up to that eventuality, because technology will run fast here, and we hope that nations will be able to have an open dialogue and come to some sort of solution.
And I think if I can also add to it, I think that there's some good news in the situation. There've been collaboration where objects from different countries, including Russia and US, docked in orbit, right? Mm-hmm. And this happened in the past. This kind of collaboration was possible in the past. And this is a field where we have to put aside, where governments have to put aside competition on a military scale to really look into collaborating to address a common problem. And if it has been possible for the ISS, it has to be possible for debris removal. And because we all coexist in the same environment, we all benefit from the same environment, and this cannot be treated in a usual competitive way. It's not possible.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so we are unfortunately almost coming to the end of our time already. There are well too many questions in the chat that I'm going to be able to get to, but I do want to go one round around the table here with a wrap-up question and give everybody a minute and a half to try to wrap up all of the great thoughts in a very brief time. So in the spotlight talk, Darren told us or suggested that we are decades beyond urgency in addressing the orbital debris challenge. So in a minute and a half or so, what is the immediate next step that we must take to start addressing that urgency and to start solving that gap? So just go around. I will pick on Charity to start. See at the bottom of my screen. Seems a good place.
Sure. I think that's a great approach. A lot of folks are thinking of active debris removal of, it's decades away and we have time. Well, we don't have time. So what can we do now? Right now, And then what do we build on to get ready? So I really think domestic national priority on space environment management, active debris removal, whatever you want to call it, make it a priority, make it a statement, and have that drive the discussions of who owns it, how are we going to fund the R&D aspects to it, how are we going to develop the PPP and the economic models, how are we going to do the international pieces, but it all starts with, laying down the policy.
So get the policy right. Luke.
Yep.
Well, there's not much to add to what Charity just said. That's I think for us, we see it exactly the same way. I think governments have to lead the first efforts. In Europe, it's already the case. I think ESA demonstrates that today there's more European agencies that are starting looking into that. So this is moving in Japan as well, and I think this should be a global effort. There's another dimension, is really this dimension of building up international collaboration to address those problems, and that's something that has to be driven probably with a very similar model that what has been done for the ISS.
Okay, Clelia, you're next on my screen.
So I think, in my opinion, that I'm a researcher. So what is my job is to understand the different solutions that we have on the table. So, and we discussed the different solution about PPP solution, but if we go through this way, we have to think about if there is a market to sustain this PPP model, and to understand how the business model of active debris removal is based on. Is based on to give profit to private sector or to save the profits. So this is a distinction that is important to understand how to develop a sustainable business model of the active debris removal. So this is the first thing that I wanted to share with you. But the second thing is that if it's not sustainable, so if it's not sustainable, the PPP model, or if it's not sustainable to think about is if the market can have the incentive, economic incentive to solve this problem alone, for sure we need the intervention of legislation. So, and to think about if we need forbidding legislative intervention, or if we need other solution, for example, to pay a fee. So each satellite operator pay a fee in order to invest in this kind of technical solution. So depends on the risk, as I said before, if the risk is now or if the risk is long term, and then to position the intervention on the public and private sector in different way along this timeline.
And Asha, the last word.
Great. So I'm going to give two since I have the last word. One is I really do think we have to develop these risk and cost benefit models that Clelia is talking about, and develop them in a holistic way that's transparent and people buy into. So I think we really need the evidence behind whatever next steps are going to take. I would say, secondly, and I do not speak on behalf of anybody, I speak on behalf of myself and representing, the Science Technology Policy Institute. I do not represent the US government here, but I do think that the US is losing an opportunity to get in terms of technology development in ADR technology, and to help to both look at their own missions as an example of a customer to use these technologies down the line, but also to buy down risk and try and better understand some of the challenges that we have on the policy side, on some of the concerns we have on the legal and policy side, and work that out. We can't admire the problem so much more unless we go forward and do it. And in order to do it, we need action from, at least in the US, we do need some direction on which agency is going to take the lead in doing it and who's going to be funded to do it.
Yeah. All right. So thank you all. To activate active debris removal, we need to know that governments must act. We need to get space environmental management policy in place, international cooperation. It was essential. We have some models that we can consider for that, the ISS cooperation, public-private partnerships. Then we really need to understand what the technical and cost-benefit risks and analyses are. in sustainable active debris removal business models and the overall risk portfolio in orbit. And we have to look for opportunities for leadership, and we need a U.S. government champion to step up and take this responsibility. So very simple, straightforward steps that we need to do, but I'm sure that we have ample opportunity to continue this conversation, and we've identified some good work to go forward. So thank you to the panelists. I wish we could keep talking. Thank you to the audience for the number of questions that were submitted. Again, I wish we could get to them all, but we certainly had a good discussion. I want to welcome my colleague Crystal back up on stage, our conference chair here, to take us out for the day. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you, Ian, and thank you again to all of our panelists from all three of our sessions today. I really couldn't be happier with what we've been able to bring you, with the discussions that we've had, and with the opportunities for follow-up that this gives us. So just to let you all know, this is day one. We're concluding now. Starting tomorrow, we're going to have another day of packed content for you. 2 panels, one on the space race, or what we really should call it, the second on the Space Force and what should be really focusing on what should be its prime directive. And then I'm also incredibly pleased to offer you 2 keynotes. One is an interview-style keynote with Tori Bruno from ULA, and one is Bhavya Law, a senior advisor at NASA, to hear a little bit about the Biden administration's priorities on space sustainability. So join us tomorrow. If you know anyone else you'd like to invite, please have them register. And we are excited for our event to continue. Thank you so much.